Welcome everyone to the September 21st, 2022 regular meeting of the San Francisco Elections Commission. I am the President, Chris Donick. The time is now 6:09 p.m. and I call the meeting to order. This meeting is being held in person at City Hall, room 408, 1 Dr. Carlton B. Goodlett Place, San Francisco, California. As authorized by the California Government Code Section 54953E, and Mayor Breed's 45th supplement to her February 25th, 2020 emergency proclamation, it is possible that some members of the Elections Commission may attend this meeting remotely. In that event, those members will participate and vote by video. Members of the public may attend the meeting to observe and provide public comment at the physical meeting location listed above or online. Instructions for providing public comment are on the agenda. In addition to participating in real time, interested persons are encouraged to participate in this meeting by submitting public comment in writing by 12 p.m. today to martha.delgadillo@sfgov.org. Before we proceed further, I'd like to ask Commission Secretary Martha Delgadillo, who is acting as our moderator, to explain some procedures for today's remote meeting.
Thank you, President Giordano. The minutes of this meeting will reflect that this meeting is being held in person at City Hall, room 408, 1 Dr. Carlton B. Goodlett Place, San Francisco, California, 94102. It is possible that some members of the Elections Commission may attend this meeting remotely. In addition to participating in real time, interested persons are encouraged to participate in this meeting by submitting public comment in writing by 12 p.m. today, September 21st, to martha.delgadillo@sf.org. It will be shared with the Commission after this meeting has concluded and will be included as part of the official meeting file. Public comment will be available on each item on this agenda. Each member of the public will be allowed 3 minutes to speak. Comments or opportunities to speak during the public comment period are available via phone call by calling 415-655-0001. Again, the phone number is 415-655-0001. Access code is 2488-548-1447. Again, 2488-548-1447, followed by the pound sign, and then press pound again to join as an attendee. You will hear a beep when you are connected to the meeting. You will be automatically muted and in listening mode only. When your item of interest comes up, dial *3 to raise your hand to be added to the public comment line. You will then hear you have raised your hand to ask a question. Please wait until the host calls on you. The line will be silent as you wait your turn to speak. Ensure you are in a quiet location. Before you speak, mute the sound of any equipment around you, including television, radio, or computer. It is especially important that you mute your computer if you are watching via the web link to prevent feedback and echo when you speak. When the system message says your line has been unmuted, this is your turn to speak. You are encouraged to state your name clearly and spell it out, please. As soon as you begin speaking, you will have 3 minutes to provide your public comment, 6 minutes if you're using an interpreter. If you change your mind and wish to withdraw yourself from the public comment line, press *3 again. You will hear the system say you have lowered your hand. When a phone is not available, you can use your computer web browser. Make sure the participant's slide panel is showing by clicking on the participants icon. Make sure the participants panel is expanded in the side panel by pressing the small arrow indicator in the panel. You should see a list of panelists followed by a list of attendees. At the bottom of the list of attendees is a small button or icon that looks like a hand. Press the hand icon to raise your hand. You will be unmuted when it is time for you to comment. When you are done with your comment, click the hand icon again to lower your hand. Once your 3 minutes have expired, staff will thank you and you will be muted. You will hear your line has been muted. Public comment instructions are listed on page 6 of the agenda. Thank you, President Giordano.
Okay, thank you, Secretary Delgadillo. Would you please proceed with the roll call?
Sure. President Giordano?
Here.
Vice President Stone?
Present.
Commissioner Bernholz?
Here.
Commissioner Dye
Here.
and Commissioner
Levosi.
Levosi.
Here.
Thank you. Okay, with 5 in attendance, we meet quorum.
Okay, great. And we have just a couple quick announcements today. First, our vice president has a new last name, so remember to say Vice President Stone. And we also have a new commissioner, Commissioner Renita Levolsi. So would you like to say a few words to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm excited and honored to be here, ready to get to work. And I am a 23-year resident of San Francisco, originally from Detroit, Michigan. And I am a director of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging at Catherine Delmar Burke School. So happy to be here.
Great, thank you. We're very happy to have you. Okay, let's move on to the first item, second item. General public comment.
Okay, I don't see any hands raised. No hands.
Okay, so we'll move on to item number 3. Discussion, possible action on resolution on continuation of remote elections commission meetings. Okay, so for this item, we have our standard resolution. The text is the same. Would anyone like to make a motion?
I move that we adopt it. Second.
Okay, so any discussion? Seeing none, let's take public comment on item number 3.
Okay, I don't see any hands raised.
Okay. So actually, it says that I'm getting a message that someone did have their hand raised.
I'm looking at the list
Yep.
and I don't see any hands.
I do see a couple actually.
Dealing with this one over here. Oh, I do see them now. Let's see. So, Mr. Turner, I'm going to unmute you. Why is it not unmuting? Try this one. Oh, unmute. Okay. You have 3 minutes, Mr. Turner.
Thank you. Martha, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thank you. And this was for a general public comment. I just wanted to say on behalf of the public, welcome to the new commissioner, and just start the meeting off with a reading into the record. I didn't get a chance to put it on the record, a statement I made to the Secretary of State's office yesterday regarding the pilot program for San Francisco. And I'll just read it quickly into the record. I don't think it'll take my 3 minutes. My statement was for the 9/20/22 hearing that the war on women's rights to have the war on a woman's right to have control over her own body is inextricably linked to the election system software and voting integrity issue. The fight against fascism and extremism in the United States is also directly linked to the fight for open source software in election systems. To avoid predictable further civil unrest in the United States, we must allow and encourage voting systems that can clearly prove the loss to the losing candidate and their followers. As open source software and paper ballots is obviously no panacea, we must therefore tighten all surrounding procedures while replacing the current corporate software systems with publicly viewable open source paper ballot systems. Almost all computer experts agree that the best practice for elections is a paper ballot open source election system. New Hampshire and Mississippi have now moved forward ahead of California. By following the suggestions of Voting Works, California now could show leadership as well, and California should therefore ignore the pressured direction of Microsoft lobbyists and the current vendors to remain in current vendor lock-in with proprietary software systems. I went on to thank the current Secretary of State, Voting Works, and the supporting organizations, National Organization of Women, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Little Hoover Commission, California Clean Money, and the San Francisco Elections Commission. So I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for your great work over the years, and I hope to make further public comment later in the event. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have one other person's hand raised, and Palmer, you are unmuted, and you have 3
Great.
minutes to comment.
It's David Pilpel. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, David.
Excellent. And if we could just give everybody a 30-second warning, including me, that would be great for the rest of the meeting. I have nothing on item 3 on the findings. I also wanted to welcome the new commissioner. Because of the camera angle, I cannot see her right now, but I believe she's right behind you and doing a fine job. Although I will say on the record, although I went to town school and my sister went to Hamlin, I think we can get along okay, even if you're working in Berks. So good. Thanks very much. That's all for now.
I don't see any other hands raised.
Okay, Secretary Delgadillo, can you take the vote?
President Giordano,
Yes.
Vice President Stone,
Yes.
Commissioner Bernholz,
Yes.
Commissioner Dye,
Aye.
and Commissioner Divolsi. Divolsi, I am so sorry.
Lee.
Divolsi.
L-I.
Volsi.
Lee Volsi.
Sorry. How do you vote?
Yes.
Okay, with 5 in the affirmative, the resolution passes.
Okay, let's move on to item number 4, approval of minutes of previous meetings. Discussion, possible action to approve minutes for the July 20th, 2022 Elections Commission meeting. So for this item, we have the draft set of minutes, and we also have a set of proposed changes from Commissioner Dye. And just at least for myself, I've looked over both. I'm happy with the minutes together with the revisions.
Same.
So would someone like to make a motion?
I motion we adopt the minutes of previous meetings for approval.
The edited version, right?
The edited version.
Second.
Okay. Any additional discussion? Okay, seeing none, let's take public comment.
Okay, it looks like Mr. Pelpel has his hand raised. Okay, Mr. Pelpel, you have 3 minutes to comment.
Great, thank you. I think I didn't see anything substantive. If I catch anything else, I'll communicate with Secretary Delgadillo, but I think a fine job was done in capturing the color and flavor of the last meeting. And in case I missed it, Mazel Tov to Vice President Stone.
Thank you.
Okay, let's take the roll call.
Okay. President Giordano, how do you vote?
Yes.
Okay, Vice President Stone,
Yes.
Commissioner Bernholz,
Yes.
Commissioner Dye,
Yes.
and Commissioner Lee Volsi.
Yes.
Thank you. With 5 in the affirmative, it passes.
Okay, let's move on to item number 5, election plan for the, actually, I want to make sure I'm reading the most recent version. Election plan and public employee waiver for the November 8th, 2022 consolidated general election. Discussion and possible action regarding the proposed election plan and the public employee waiver for the November 8th, 2022 consolidated general election. Okay, so Director Arntz, would you like to make any comments about the plan? Thank you very much for providing that.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Just briefly, so we did try to highlight our efforts around redistricting and reprecincting so that people understand the efforts we're putting into inform people of the changes, potentially if they receiving a ballot with a different, especially supervisor or just supervisor, or not have a ballot with supervisor on it. Then also we did take a look at our program with people who are incarcerated, so that try to get an equity look, so that we could provide them services that were on par with other voters despite their circumstances. And then, that one thing that's not clear in the plan, I think I'll indicate, is that these services will continue through Election Day. And so, although we can't personally go to the jails, interact with the folks, depending on the availability and the time that prisoner legal services personnel have, if we were to get a registration affidavit on Election Day, we would package a ballot and bring it to the jails for prisoner legal services to provide to the persons who incarcerated, get that ballot back, and then bring it back. So that's not clear in the plan. And other than that, I can take any questions on the plan.
Okay, thank you, Director Arntz. Commissioners, are there any questions?
I have a lot of questions, but I actually will just immediately respond to what you brought up, Director Arntz. I was really happy to see the inclusion and the explanation of the folks that are system impacted. I had a specific question about that. So on page 14 of the election plan, so I was confused about, because you talk about in the kind of later parts of the plan as it pertains to folks who are in the county jails. And then on page 14, I believe it speaks to what the state law requires from the Secretary of State with the list of persons recently imprisoned. And it says the department in turn will need to, 1, cancel the voter record of each person on the first list, and then not either, but 2, notify each person on the second list. So I was wondering if you could just clarify why, well, actually, first, is this pertaining to SF specific jails or SF specific residents or voters who are incarcerated elsewhere in the state? That's my question number 1. And then question number 2 is, can you just explain or clarify what you mean by canceling the voter record of those incarcerated folks?
So so this program hasn't really started yet.
Got it.
So previously, the Superior Courts in each county provided elections offices lists of people who were convicted of felonies.
Right, yeah.
And so the departments had to go through the information, try to find matches within their databases. Now with the statewide database, the VoteCal, the Secretary of State, now the change in state law, the Secretary of State's office will now be the point for receiving that information from the Superior Courts. And so each individual department in each county will not be receiving these lists, but the Secretary of State's office will receive them from the court system. And then then the Secretary of State's office will match the records in the statewide database. And then where the Secretary of State's office thinks there's a match in a county, it'll send that record in VoteCal to the county. And the county would make the final decision if the information from the Secretary of State's office that came originally from the court system matches a record of a local voter. And if it does, then we would cancel that record since that person is convicted of serving time for a felony conviction.
Got it. So just to translate what you said, it's across the state for folks who are currently incarcerated for a felony conviction, removing them from your voter rolls for specific elections on a weekly basis,
Right.
ensuring that it's up to date. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay, that makes sense, because it does talk about canceling and then also educating those who had their rights restored. And so I got a little confused between the two. And then I wanted to ask a little bit more about in the jails. Like I said, I was really excited to see this be such a big point of the plan. And I especially was interested excited about on page 23, the component of VALIS status notifications. So I just mostly wanted to call that out because I think that's really great work. I had spoken to someone, and I don't know if I had mentioned this to you, but I had spoken to someone at a certain point about formerly incarcerated folks in the county who had specifically expressed concern about whether or not their ballots were even being counted once they were given to the folks in the jails. So I just wanted to call that out. I have other questions, but I'll let the other commissioners ask, and then I can come back to them because they're less about system impacted folks.
Anyone else? Okay. Commissioner Bernholtz?
Thanks. I thank you, Director Arntz, and welcome to our new commissioner. Sorry not to be there to meet you in person. I have a question about people people expressing interest in serving as poll watchers. I don't know if there's been an uptick in any of that, or when does that process begin, and if you've had any sense that there'll be an increase in people wanting to be poll watchers in November.
Not in San Francisco, we've not had. I've not come across any activity around people wanting to be poll watchers or observers yet. Usually, that's closer. That activity will happen closer to the election, and it can happen right up until election day. There's like really no set period when people would show an interest, and it's But since this is a general election, I assume that we will. But really, every election in San Francisco, we have observers and poll watchers anyway. That's not unique. A lot of times, a lot of the community organizations or advocacy organizations organize their personnel to canvass polling places in San Francisco. So we're somewhat used to it. Poll workers are used to it. Something certainly we put into the materials in the training for poll workers. But there's nothing. Put it this way, nothing unusual at this time in relation to people wanting to be present at polling places for November.
Thank you.
Director Arntz, thank you for your usual very thorough report. This is your fourth election for the year. I'm just wondering if there's anything that is keeping you up at night for this one.
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, I guess we get to more of my director's report as well. But I mean, we're moving. Everything's moving at pace. We're on schedule. Nothing's been late. Pork recruiting's somewhat in early stages, so I don't have really a sense of where that's going. But we have less polling places this time around, so I would think that we'll have sufficient numbers of poll workers. No, right now, I think everything's coming together. So no, I'm not up late at night worrying about the election specifically. So.
Okay, for this item, there's actually two motions that we would want to entertain. The first is basically approving of the plan, and then the second one is approving the waiver request. Did you want to say something? Okay. And I'm told that we can do them together. We can approve both of them together.
Yes, you can, Deputy City Attorney Flores, you can, the motion can say, motion to approve the elections plan and the employee waiver.
So moved.
She has more questions.
I'm sorry, I had just two more questions before we make a vote, if that's okay, if we get to the motion.
Sure.
Thanks. I had a question as it pertains to the grant recipients that are included on page 13, as it pertains to the voter participation. I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about that process and how the grant recipients were determined and evaluated.
So we issued actually 3 RFPs because we didn't have sufficient responses. The initial RFP that we issued, and the criteria were that they provide outreach to certain groups of people, like low turnout areas, people with needing language assistance, non-citizen voters, potential non-citizen voters, And we set the criteria up, and then we asked they send bids to us. And then we have a criteria that we set according to the RFP, and then we compare that criteria to their actual responses, because the responses don't always match the criteria of the RFPs. So even though a group might be requesting, let's say, $50,000, their proposed actions may not match the criteria in the RFP. So then we reduce the amount that we provide in the grant based on the percentage of what they said they're going to do in relation to the criteria that we set.
And is that determined by just like the evaluation committee for that? Is that determined by you and like your direct reports, or who is making the determination about who receives the funding?
So we have a panel. We set up a panel in the department. I'm not on the panel. I don't select the grantees. And but then once we get the panel will select the winning bids. But then when it comes to time for the negotiations, essentially, then that would be our deputy director and also our budget and finance manager would be looking at the responses from in relation to how much we would provide to the grantees.
Okay, cool. Thank you for clarifying that. I did have one more item specific to the the voter outreach impact survey, though I think we could probably talk a little bit more about that as we get into other topics. Mostly, I just wanted to ask if there are any concerns, or I guess what the past participation is of people actually completing that when it's in the voter, just because, there are 260 or 250 pages of the voter information pamphlet. And so I'm just wondering, because I think it says it's in the back of the document, if folks actually do participate in that survey previously.
This is the first time I'm aware of us actually having one in the voter guide.
This is the first
Yeah,
time.
so we'll see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely am curious to see. Cool. Thanks.
Mhm.
Those
And
are
this will also be on our website, so we'll have a page.
right.
So
I like that there are multiple forms of feedback. Thanks.
Okay, are there any other questions for Director Arntz? Okay, so we had a motion by Commissioner Dye. Would someone like to second that motion?
Second.
Okay. So let's have public comment on item number 5.
We do have one person whose hand is raised. I believe it's Mr. Pilpel. You are unmuted. You have 3 minutes to comment on the election plan for the November 8th, 2022 consolidated.
Great, thank you very much. So I went through the elections plan. I'm sorry I did not read every word, but I went through each page, and there's a lot of good stuff on there. Good focus for many pages on the various notices that the department sends out to appropriate audiences, with specific notices about the changed lines and changed circumstances and changed whateverness. Really good focus on the notices. And in general, I think it's nice that the plan has the same basic content for a number of pages that doesn't really vary much from election to election, but that there are other aspects of the plan that change to appropriately reflect the current focus and other change laws and practices and whatnot. So as I've said many times before, I think the elections plan is a good concept in law, and I think the way this director and this department are implementing it really is a model for others. Anybody who claims that, they have no idea how our elections work and it's all black box and da-da-da. No, we actually have a very detailed public plan that gets followed, and as I say, it's really a model. It's not just Director Arntz, but all the staff in the department that make it happen, write it, live it, love it, all of that. So I support the motion to adopt the plan, grant the waivers, and thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pilpel. Any other commenters?
There are no other hands raised?
Okay, any additional discussion before we take a vote? Commissioner Dye?
Yeah, actually, and I wonder if you can just explain what the thinking is behind the need for this public employee waiver?
Oh, wait, one minute. Yes, so the public employee waiver is something that the Department of Election is allowed to request, and that allows, John can correct me if I'm wrong, that allows city employees that want to participate in elections the ability to do so.
But what's the thinking, but why there needs to be a waiver? Why wouldn't, is it a pay issue?
It's in the charter. So the charter requires the department to obtain a waiver that would be approved by the commission, then later approved by the board of supervisors to allow city employees who aren't employees of the department to assist with the elections. And this is the same charter amendment that created the elections commission. And so the idea at the time, one of the primary arguments was that the mayor's office was potentially too involved in elections in San Francisco. So the idea was, and also that through the mayor, people in other departments were getting too involved, and potentially elections weren't being conducted in a neutral, free, fair, and functional manner. So that was the argument then, and now it's in the charter. And this is why this waiver is before you today.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So this was concern about political taint, basically.
And I wouldn't have been able to tell you what happened 20 years ago, so thank you, John.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, anything else?
I did want to say one other thank you, which was the inclusion of the de-escalation techniques. I was really happy to see that. So thanks to you and team.
Okay, yeah, thank you again, Director Arntz. Secretary Delgadillo, can you take the roll?
Sure. President Jardone,
Yes.
Vice President Stone,
Yes.
Commissioner Bernholz,
Yes.
Commissioner Dye,
Aye.
and Commissioner DeVolsi.
Yes.
Thank you. With 5 votes in the affirmative, it passes.
Okay, let's move on to item number 6, information reported regularly to the commission. Discussion and possible action regarding information for reporting to the commission on a regular basis, including in the director's monthly reports, the department's annual proposed budget, and after each election when reviewing the election. Okay, so this is an item that is an outgrowth of the BOPEC meeting that we had last month, and basically took the input from the BOPEC meeting and wrote everything down so we can have a written record of the things the commission would like to see on a regular basis. It's pretty like standard things that Director Arntz has been providing in the past. And so if this is something that people are okay with, we can vote on it today. Otherwise, it's something we can wait on. And the one thing I'd like to emphasize about this is that it's meant to be a living document. We should always feel free that if we want to add something or remove something or change the way something is worded, we should feel free to update it as time goes on. So with that, would anyone like to have any questions about the document that I put together? Yes.
Not questions, but I have suggestions of things that I would want to be included. Do you want me to wait until other folks ask their questions?
It's up to you. You can.
Okay, well, I'll just jump in then. I would love to include the number of EEO complaints. That was interesting to see that had been included in previous meetings. And I think it would be good to know kind of also from like an equity perspective, understanding kind of from a high level, maybe on a quarterly basis, what's happening under the surface. Is that something we can include in, well, I guess I propose that we include that in here.
On that topic, so
yeah.
the department cannot provide that information. It has to come from DHR.
Okay.
Yeah, so for people's understanding, this is Vice President Stone's referencing something that was in the introductory text I provided for the document. And going back about, I think it may have been like 6 years ago or something, I'm just guessing, we did have a sort of a standing request to receive the number of EEO complaints, and it's something that our deputy city attorney provided to us on a quarterly basis. And then just at some point, we just sort of forgot about it and stopped receiving those numbers. But it's something we could revive, and we could find a way to get it from DHR, maybe through our deputy city attorney or otherwise.
Yeah, that would be great if we could include that. At least for the last like year or two.
Just, if I may, Commissioner.
Oh, yeah. I
So,
didn't-
just to be clear, are you asking the city attorney's office to ask whether the commission can get, this EEO complaints on a quarterly basis?
Well, we were receiving them before, so I assume that we
Okay.
can still continue to do so.
Yeah, I'll definitely, do some research and I can get back to you, at the next meeting about, what can be done.
Okay.
Can I also propose that in addition to if we are able to do that, also being able to see like the most recent, like the last year or two of complaints by quarter? Deputy Flores?
Same.
The same complaints, the EEO complaints, but for the last 2 years, you're saying?
Yeah, I
Okay.
think that would be helpful, just so that, I mean, if we see the number for this quarter without knowing the context of the last quarter or the quarters before that, it just helps to have a basis of understanding.
Yes, I'll definitely do that research and get back to you about whether we can, one, give you that information, and two, how far back we can go.
Thanks. The other items I wanted to bring up were on page 2 of President Jordanik's document. Specifically, I wanted to include timing as a component of this. So looking at, actually there was one other in addition to this one, but looking at the timing of when people are voting by those specific methods. So I was thinking perhaps if we do 2A through D, we could have it be more of a matrix as it pertains to, number 1 and 2, how people are voting and when they are voting in that method. And then the other specific question I had is on 3B, if we could incorporate system impacted folks. So those that are currently incarcerated in SF jails. And I suppose those who have had their rights restored, though it seems like that might be a more complicated process. And then also interested in folks who are registered to an intersection rather than a physical address. I don't know if that's a huge undertaking, Director Ernst, so it's definitely not an immediate ask, but if those things are something we can just incorporate into the data, that would be, I think, really valuable.
I didn't understand the timing.
Oh, the timing. So
Which items?
yeah, so timing was specific to page 2, number 2. So in terms of the counting of the ballots, and you remember when we were talking about
Counting or receiving?
Is this under the vote by mail ballot section?
Yes.
We can do that. We track the daily amounts that we receive. Counting them, that's we can, that's different. Receiving we can, yeah, we definitely can give you a count for the days during the early voting cycle.
Yeah.
Then a count per day, that would be.
Oh, per day. Yeah, it would, I
That-
guess.
I mean, we can do it, but it's not going to match 1-to-1 because we'll start receiving ballots like 30 days before the election. We're not going to start
Yeah.
count. Okay.
It more so, I should have clarified, when we were talking in, I think, the last regular meeting or the one before that, as it pertains to the different phases. So before Election Day, and then obviously Election Day, that there's that block that is not a counting day, and then the ones in the days that follow in the provisionals, et cetera. And so looking at how people are voting, if they're using the vote centers versus dropping off in a drop box versus dropping it in the mailbox, when they're using those specific methods based on which phase.
Yeah,
Does
we
that make sense?
that we can provide.
Yeah, not by day. That would be way more information than, yeah, just by phase would be awesome. And then the other one was 3B. where number of ballots cast using emergency voting. And then it says e.g. hospitalized or homebound. And I was suggesting that we also add folks who are incarcerated in SF jails, potentially also folks that are registered to an intersection as opposed to a physical address, because I'm really interested to see how that is, what that looks like. And then also, depending on the suit that has gone back and forth for your department, but non-citizen voting as well. I think it would be helpful. I don't know if there are some other implications as it pertains to that one, but it would be great to at least try to incorporate at least one of these additional groups.
And you want totals or you want by day totals?
Oh, total, just,
Okay, okay. Yeah, we can do that.
I don't think by days.
All right.
It already sounds like the voting in jail is a very, it's a very complicated process. So just generally at the
Okay.
high level would be great.
Sure.
Cool, thank you.
Mhm.
Those were, oh, and then we did talk in BOPEC about qualitative insights and not just quantitative insights, though. That's just, yeah.
Okay, so for the, on the timing one, were you interested in both the time of as ballots are counted, you want to see that, as well as when they're submitted? So there's sort of two separate graphs. One is,
Or do you just want it by early voting, election day, and the week after?
What do you mean by it? Because you said when they're counted versus when they're,
yeah, so I guess one graph could be a graph of how many ballots are counted over time, because after election night, each day more ballots get counted. And then there's the other issue that Director Arndt said of, people are mailing in, ballots as the election day approaches, which is going to be, you're going to kind of see a different graph over time.
I'm more interested, I suppose, in the short term in terms of, I suppose, counting, though I
Receiving.
received,
Yeah.
yeah, received, that's what I mean.
Because we're trying to understand how people are voting and when.
Right,
And when the.
based
poll
on that
is.
method, exactly. I was getting all jungled, yeah.
Because-
How they vote and where, and I also at some point would love to be able to look even at that based on precincts of turnout in past elections as well. So for example, looking at mail-in voting in specific communities that historically didn't have high turnout rates, it would be great to see the impact and trending over time.
Mhm.
So yeah, received. That's a long-winded answer.
With the change of precincts and districts, that's a little bit of a challenge. Okay.
Yeah. That's good.
So-
Okay, are there any other comments?
I think the main thing that I thought was good in the summary that we also talked about at VOPEC is just putting it in context over time so we can see trends. So I think that's very helpful since there was a fairly dramatic change that just accelerated during the pandemic. So it's helpful.
Okay, and then Vice President Stone, in terms of your suggested additions, like how do you think we should, would you like, if we consider voting on something today, should we like add that language, just, kind of whatever we adopt today would have that language?
Yes,
Okay,
I would definitely like to do that.
okay, and then I guess we would maybe, in the motion, we'd want to just kind of delegate to, so we don't have to work out the exact language now.
Exactly.
Okay. To make it go a little bit easier. Okay, so are there any other comments before we open it up to public comment on this item? Okay, so let's take public comment on item number 6.
Mr. Pelpel, you're going to be unmuted, and you will be commenting on approval of public employee waiver for the
No.
November 8th, 20.
It's the other, this,
That's the one.
The next one, yeah.
Okay, then, information reported regularly to the commission. Okay, and you are unmuted, you have 3 minutes to comment.
Great, thank you. So I think on the last point that I think the Vice President Stone was discussing, it's about source. There are kind of three areas that I can think of: the source of the ballot, the date received, and the date processed or counted. And for source, I think it's a variety of things, and I guess what's in section 2 on page 3 of the packet, page 2 of the document, that kind of makes sense. By mail, at polling place, drop box, voting center. If there are other sources, then, you know, whatever those sources are. For date received, I believe there is an absolute date that a ballot is received by the department, and that's helpful for looking at, what's the term, longitudinally, when votes come in, and then for date processed or counted, when they were counted, and that, I suppose, is either up to 7 days before or maybe just the day of, up to E plus the last day that votes are processed or counted. So those are kind of different things, but they are all relevant to evaluating.
Very bad day today, by the way. Period.
Yes, it is.
We'll be celebrating that along with your birthday.
Mr. Turner, you're unmuted right now. Okay.
That wasn't me. That was Mr. Kieran. Okay, so I think I've made clear what those three issues are. I would try to include what makes sense to include that's relatively easy for the department to do. I mean, I think there's a balance between having this be meaningful and have this be manageable. I have no objection to the non-citizen voting and people that don't have a physical address, so you can determine like what the percent turnout is among the homeless. That's all good stuff. That's totally cool. In terms of how you deal with this particular document, I have no objection to delegating the authority to the president to finalize it. I'll just conclude. To finalize the document, I would think about whether you want to make this a standalone resolution of the commission to set these as items and review this periodically. Thanks. Or how you want to handle it so that this doesn't just get lost in the shuffle. I think this is a really important document. Thanks for listening.
Okay, we have Daniel, I hope I'm not mispronouncing it, Deibler, who would also like to comment. And Mr. Deibler, you are unmuted. You have 3 minutes to comment on information reported regularly to the commission.
You got my first or my last name right, which is amazing, actually. But my first name is Danielle.
Danielle, I apologize, Danielle.
That's okay.
Wow.
So I just wanted to comment on, I'm with the League of Women Voters. I run the voter services component, which is the nonpartisan educational component for elections. And one thing that would really be useful, I think, to a lot of 501(c)(3)s in the community is how early people are voting, because it helps to understand if people are voting really early, right? If the majority of people are voting on October 10th, it helps us with educational events that we're doing around candidates or around things like ballot propositions. So from my perspective, one of the most important things that we can understand in kind of this new set of reporting guidelines, even if you can't give us historical information, if going forward we can understand how are people voting, but also how early are the ballots coming in. I definitely care about counting as well, but to understand how early do we need to schedule events to make sure that the public has the educational resources that they need is very important to us. And I think that would be something that would be a really great additional statistic to include. I definitely also on how they're voting. right? So that we can encourage people to kind of vote in the ways that make it easier for the Department of Elections to be able to count their votes, be able to, man the right number of polling stations, and all of that kind of stuff is also really interesting to us. But I would say my number one, especially based on this election, is how early are people casting their ballots, and what's the way that they're getting those ballots to you. So not necessarily when they're being counted, because I understand that doesn't happen until a little bit later, but how early they're getting them to you, so that we can understand when do we need to schedule educational content on our side, and when do other people need to schedule educational content to make sure that voters are informed. And that's it. Thank you very much.
And next we have Mr. Turner. And Mr. Turner, you are commenting on information reported regularly to the commission. You are unmuted and you have 3 minutes to comment.
Thank you, Martha. I just wanted to apologize for being unmuted and making comment about the political events of the day, and to clarify, although I am a Democrat and our work is adopted by the Democratic Party in California, this is nonpartisan work, so please take my previous comment with apology. Thank you.
So we have no more hands raised.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Deibler, Mr. Turner, Mr. Pilpel. Okay, so I just want to get one more clarification in terms of the timing. Did you want the granularity was like on a weekly basis, or?
I was thinking in the phases that we had discussed, based on what the director had shared, is how they, based on how they actually approach counting, that would be, we would use those. I think it was 4 phases that we use that way, but I'm open. That was just an initial proposal.
Okay.
It sounded like the comment from the league is that they would actually like to know with a little bit more granularity, because there's 29 days of early voting, so maybe by week.
Okay, so yeah.
During the cycle, our website actually posts the number of ballots received, vote by mail and from the voting center. Those are the 2 main sources. So the league could get the information that way. And this is for the post-election reports that we're discussing here. So.
Yeah, and then just to also clarify, you'd want to see the graph, separately for them by mail, by the polling, or not polling place, by the drop box and at the voting center.
Yes.
Okay, and then Director Ernst, that's doable with relatively.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so do we have a motion on this?
Yeah.
Anybody, or?
Motion to adopt this information we want reported regularly, pending also the amendments, the minor amendments to be included afterward.
Okay, and then this is something that we could post on our website, next to our other main documents, like our bylaws and so on, to address the point about this not getting forgotten. Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay. Is there any further discussion before we take a roll call vote?
May I just make one point before we take the vote? Martha, will you make sure it's Lee Volsey, not D Volsey? Lee Volsey, yes. Okay, I thought I heard D. I want to make sure.
But Anna set me straight.
Okay, before we got into the voting, I didn't want to interrupt. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so President Giordano, how do you vote?
Yes.
Vice President Stone,
Yes.
Commissioner Bernholz,
Yes.
Commissioner Dye,
Aye.
and Commissioner Lee Volsey.
Yes.
Thank you. With 5 in the affirmative, it passes.
Okay, great. So, and then thank you, Director Ernst, for being able to provide this additional information. It's going to be very useful. Okay, so next item And then just to make sure this is the updated agenda, item number 7, racial equity. Discussion and possible action regarding equity considerations for the Commission and Department of Elections. Okay, Vice President Stone, this was the item that you had requested. So
Yes.
turn it over to you.
Yes, this will be actually just a quick update from BOPEC for the folks on the commission who were not in that specific meeting, just to give a high level and then also provide a couple of updates since then. So just in terms of how we're approaching equity and thinking about it, one of the ways that we had approached looking at the issue generally is to talk about it in kind of 2 phases or 2 different buckets. The first is commission specific. So internally, what are the ways that we are considering diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, justice into our actual processes as a commission? And then the second kind of bucket is how are we thinking about the policies and the priorities that we are evaluating and, for lack of a better word, prioritizing in thinking about the communities that we serve. So we spent most of the time kind of talking about the commission first. Specifically, I wanted to provide an update on the land acknowledgement, which I unfortunately, well, actually, it's fortunate because I had the opportunity to work with the Ramaytush Ohlone Association, and I'm in process of talking to the American Indian Cultural District about the land acknowledgement and then also potential follow-ups from there. But the unfortunate part was I only got approval on that draft like 2 hours ago, and so it didn't make it into the 72-hour window. But the good news of that is I drafted a resolution that has been approved, and I will present it at the October meeting with a little bit more context on that conversation and just the way the city is approaching this generally. The other item that we discussed in the last meeting or in BOPEC, was to incorporate our pronouns on the website. And I'd like for us to be able to vote on that today, especially with a new commissioner on board, and incorporating everyone in that discussion. Should we all agree, I would propose that we incorporate our pronouns just in the About Us area right next to our names. And we can just have everyone submit that to Chris or me or Martha to get that updated. The other few things that I wanted to just bring up are additional training and resources for how we can incorporate equity into our conversations, our vernacular, into the ways that we are evaluating plans, election plans, and things of that kind. That's something that's down the line, was a discussion area in BOPEC that I am continuing to work on as an aside. The other last 2 things are maintaining racial equity or just equity in general as an agenda item until it is fully integrated into our work more consistently, even if it's just a quick update on what's going on with it or folks having ideas. I think it's good to include that as an item as well. And then I wanted to pass it over to Chris and Cynthia, to Commissioner Ty and President Jardonic to share a quick update on their specific items that we talked about at BOPEC, and if you have any. Otherwise, we can punt it till October.
So my task was to research the one of the things we discussed at the meeting was whether for example, members of the Elections Commission could be compensated. It might be make it easier for people to participate as commissioners. And so my job was to research like the status of that. I did find some information. I didn't write it down as a memo, but I could do that for the next meeting. But basically, there's a really good document from the city attorney's office that actually David Pilpel pointed me to. And to make a long story short, the San Francisco's charter does not permit members of the Elections Commission to be compensated. So that's a charter provision that just applies specifically to us. And I can provide pointer to that in a document for the next meeting.
So as it pertains to that, I think I actually mentioned that in our BOPEC meeting, that it is in the charter, though I think we had discussed that there may be specific ways that we could discuss changing that should it be a priority. I still am going to continue to suggest that it is a priority.
Yeah, and we could, you know, we could, for example, recommend that that be changed. And then, but what I'll do is I'll provide a pointer to the city attorney document that discusses all of the commissions and what
Yeah.
they're doing.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, and then I had offered to follow up with the 311 database that lists all of the commissioners. So thanks to Secretary Delgadillo, I was referred to a contact, our contact there for the 311 database, and she did elevate it up her management chain. And I did hear back from the director of the 311 Customer Service Center, where they basically said they had worked with a third-party vendor to create the commissioner database according to the ordinance, which of course did not have any race or ethnicity identification for the commissioners. So she suggested that if we wanted to follow up on this, that we follow up with the Human Rights Commission, the City Attorney's Office, the Mayor's Office, or DHR for their thoughts on this proposal. Just to summarize for the folks who were not in attendance at our BOPEC meeting, we had talked about the possibility of voluntary self-identification because the Department on the Status of Women does this wonderful aggregated report on all commissions and reports on gender, race, and ethnicity, and other items. But actually, you wouldn't know that looking at any one particular commission, what the composition of the commission is. And we had talked about doing it for our commission on our About Us page, and then perhaps inviting other commissions to also voluntarily disclose information. And the idea of doing it voluntarily is that obviously we want to make that a choice, whether people disclose that information or not. So I had tried to maybe track down the head of the Commission on the Status of Women. Unfortunately, she saw her yesterday in an event, unfortunately was not able to grab her. But I just wonder if that's something that they've considered, because they actually have to do this through a survey each time, every couple of years, to get this information.
Thanks. Thank you for the update. But I think in the meantime, just starting with pronouns on our website as at least a starting point probably makes the best sense. And then kind of we go from there. Well, I guess we should someone should have to make a motion on that, but I would be interested to hear other people's perspective on the pronouns specifically.
I'm okay with either or both, you know.
I'm okay with the pronouns. I do think that for race and ethnicity, it'll be very important that it be of a voluntary nature. But I think it would be also important if we're thinking about equity, that we think about racial equity in particular. How do people have access to be a part of this? I think that's what's key.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, which is a lot of the reason why. Actually, let me ask you a clarified question. You say a part of this. Do you mean the commission?
The commission, yes.
Exactly. I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was some of the context of the compensation component, is that, it requires a pretty significant amount of work and time and, transportation, et cetera, to participate, let alone have a leadership position on the commission. And so thinking of ways that we can create more accessibility specifically compensation, was one thing that we had discussed. But then another thing which I was going to bring up in the later, but I think it's actually quite relevant here, is working with community groups that are doing this in other counties. So there is a group called Urban Habitat that trains people to be prepared to join commissions from communities of color and from low-income communities. And so I've started to engage them as well on this topic. And I know this is your area of expertise. So if you would like to participate in any and all, would welcome that, but also recognize it's labor. So thank you for the feedback in this meeting.
Would you like to go ahead and move on the motion for the pronouns?
Yeah, I motion that we include our pronouns on our commission website.
A second?
Okay, have a motion and a second. Any further discussion before we take public comment on this item? Okay, so let's take public comment on item number 7, racial equity.
Okay, so we do have a hand raised. I believe it's Mr. Pell, and you will be commenting on the racial equity. You have 3 minutes to comment, and you're unmuted.
Great, thank you. So this is on the entire item, not just the instant motion? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, let's see, here's a pronoun. I have no objection to the motion before you. Very good. Right, that's fine. And however you want to handle not just the website, but perhaps you want to be consistent with the minutes going forward. I would not go back and fix prior minutes, but however you want to handle it, if someone identifies themselves with a preferred pronoun, if you want to use that pronoun in subsequent references to that person, I think that would make sense. Again, I wouldn't make a big deal about it, but hey, if this is important to various people, then so be it. I did want to touch on another issue about compensation. I can't remember if I commented at the previous meeting, not just about compensation for members of the body, but other potential benefits to reduce barriers, such as free parking in the garage, access to Muni, access to technology. I mean, if you really want to make it, despite the charter restriction on compensation, and you may want to revisit that with the redistricting task force recommendations, if that's going to result in the charter amendment. But even within the existing framework, if there are things that the city can do to reduce barriers so that anyone could serve on the commission, assuming they are at least 8th grade level of intelligence, but regardless of their economic circumstances, if they need a headset, if they need a laptop, if they need access to transportation, let's figure that out. I mean, those dollar costs are not high, but those costs to the city in terms of limiting the number of people who can serve are pretty high, and I am sensitive to that. So I hope those comments are helpful. I see some nodding of heads, or at least one head nodding. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pilpel.
Okay, we do have Mr. Turner. And Mr. Turner, you are unmuted and you are commenting on racial equity. You have 3 minutes to comment.
Yes, thank you, commissioners, for your sensitivity and good forward thinking on this issue. I don't want it trivialized, and on behalf of the public, it shouldn't be considered as an issue that may be important to various people. I think this is of the utmost importance, and thank you for your attention to this matter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Turner. Anyone else?
I don't see any other hands raised. Oh, wait, I do. Oh, hold on one second, sorry. So Tess Wellborn, I am going to unmute you and you are commenting on racial equity. You have 3 minutes to comment. You are unmuted.
Hi. I'm not familiar with the background discussion on this item. I wondered, though, if you were interested in other kinds of equity too, besides racial, which is obviously the most important that I can think of as an issue in our city and around our country. But if you wanted to consider equity, well, you've alluded to considering equity in terms of income when you talk about compensation or other benefits. Another category you might consider or may have considered already is the LGBTQ plus community. I'm not sure that we have a good equity in that category, but I'd certainly work on racial first and income. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So I do not see any other hands raised.
Okay, so we have a motion before us. Any last discussion before we take a vote on it? Okay, Secretary Delgadillo?
Okay, I'm sorry, President Jordan,
Yes?
Vice President Stone,
Yes.
Commissioner Bernholz,
Yes.
Commissioner Dye,
Aye.
and Commissioner Lee Volsi.
Yes.
Okay, with 5 in the affirmative, that passes.
Okay, and then as Vice President Stone said, if you could pass along that information to Secretary Delgadillo, and then we'll get that up on the website. Okay, next item, item number 8, Director's Report. Discussion and possible action regarding the Director's Report. So Director Arntz, thank you for your report today.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Just a couple items. So on Saturday, we'll be mailing the ballots to the military and overseas voters. The voter guides will be dropping in the post office that first week of October. And then the ballots will be dropping in the post office October 6th. So the ballots and the voter guides will be arriving in people's mailboxes probably simultaneously for the most part for this election.
With a
The
thud.
voter,
With a thud.
with the thud. So the voter guide is 256 pages for this election. You saw the number of measures and arguments for each measure. But yeah, so everything's in line though.
Okay,
Any
thank you.
questions?
I'm just curious to know how much of a response you received from when you did the outreach asking folks if they wanted to have a digital version.
I don't know. I didn't get a number. I didn't ask. I'll have to follow up on that.
I was not one of them, mostly
Oh.
because, mostly just because I wanted to really see what folks who are receiving it look like with the 250 pages. Has that document ever been that long?
Yes.
Yes.
What is it? When has it been? What's the longest it's ever?
We had a 300 pager. I think it was 2016.
Okay.
Yeah.
We had double letters and
Yeah. Right.
Well, it's just interesting that it's in a midterm election. Anyways, that I'm interested to hear more about that, perhaps in the post-election conversation we can talk about what that process was like.
Okay.
I have a question. So those who received this ability to have this electronic version are only those who put their email on their registration form, or how was that? How did you get the emails to find out if people wanted to do it?
So the only people that received the email were those who provided emails, but receiving the link to the voter guide, which is on our website, isn't limited to those people.
Okay.
Yeah. And mostly we do receive the email addresses from people when they register to vote.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Bless you. Maybe we should have all worn masks. Bless you.
Bless you. Okay, are there any more questions before we? Oh, I'm sorry. Commissioner Bernholz.
Thank you. Director Arntz, quick question on item 1 E, I'm wondering if there's anything that the commission should be aware of from your meetings with the Secretary of State and Voting Works about the open source voting pilot.
Commissioner Jordanik's probably the best source, but we've had 2 calls since the last commission meeting, and from my perspective at least, I think the main topic is Voting Works thinks the state needs to reduce the amount of information required for the application for the pilot program. And that's what's been in conversation. But I'll leave that, perhaps that's a later item for Commissioner Jordanik to also speak about.
Thank you.
I will be mentioning that in my report.
Okay,
A little
okay,
bit more
thank
on
you.
that. Okay, let's take public comment on item number 8, Director's Report.
Thank you. We do have a hand raised. It is Mr. Pilpel. You are unmuted. You have 3 minutes to comment on the the director's report.
Okay, and again, please try to keep the mic in front of you. Yep, hard to hear. Okay, I went back just now to check the November 1995 VIP, which it looks like was only 204 pages. I thought that was the longest at the time because it had the new charter in it, but apparently I'm wrong, that there have been other longer VIPs. But yeah, depending on the number of ballot arguments and the text of measures and all kinds of other stuff, that'll influence the weight and heft of the VIP. But once again, the director's report is quite comprehensive with all the things going on. So there's a huge amount of transparency as to what's going on in the department. So I appreciate that very much, and thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pilpel.
And Mr. Turner also has his hands raised. Mr. Turner, you have 3 minutes to comment on the director's report.
Thank you, Martha. Again, some of the framing, I think we should be aware. I'd like, as a member of the public, I'd like to hear more, perhaps not tonight, but perhaps next time, from the director regarding his thoughts on the conversations with the Secretary of State. I heard him say that if he had to summarize, that his summary would be that Voting Works thinks that the state should reduce the amount of documentation that should be required of them. And I appreciate that summary, but I'd like to hear more in depth from the director, as this, I think, most everyone would agree is the most important issue currently in front of the commission and in front of the county and maybe the state and maybe the country, which is how we best upgrade the current proprietary systems that suffer that black box software issue, how we upgrade to a system that enjoys more transparency. There may be good transparency in other areas with the Department of Elections, but unfortunately, this is something that is beyond the director's control, as he's naturally been relegated over the past years to the available systems. Now that there is better, more transparent systems available, it would be great to get his thoughts regarding those conversations with the Secretary of State. Thank you.
And we have one more commenter. It's Danielle Diebler, I'm sorry. And you are unmuted and you have 3 minutes to comment on racial equity.
So we talked a
Sorry,
little
I'm
bit.
sorry.
On the
I'm so
director's
sorry.
report.
It's the director's report.
Your director's report. Sorry, I was like, I'm pretty sure I'm not commenting on racial equity. So the one thing I would say, as we talk about kind of things like open source voting, I definitely would caution. I'm a huge proponent of open source. I use it a lot in my regular day-to-day job. But I would definitely caution the Department of Elections and also the Commission to make sure that you take into account the potential cyber threats that are potentially more exposed on open source software than they might be on closed source systems. I'm not really necessarily advocating for one or the other, but understanding the kind of the threat landscape against essentially voting and the process in the United States and specifically in California and San Francisco, and making sure that we really have a good plan in place to make sure that we have the right audit pipeline. We really understand what's going on, and we understand how to recognize any kind of cybersecurity threat that would actually be, launched against a potential election. That's when software is open source, it's also easier to reverse engineer it. That's a positive, actually, and it's also easier to audit it, but it's also a negative in some cases. And so making sure that you have the right people at the table making the decision, and you have somebody with some cybersecurity experience walking you through what the potential implications of switching from one platform to another are, I think is really important. And making sure that especially the DOE, the Department of Elections, has those types of resources available to them, even if they're consulting resources in the short term. It just feels like I'm commenting as a citizen, not as a league, but I do feel like that's one thing that you really need to pay attention to when it comes to using some kind of an open source voting system. It's great because it does allow for a lot of transparency, but that transparency can turn on you. And so you want to understand how do you react to that and how do you mitigate it? And that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Steidler.
Yep, I don't see any other hands raised.
Okay, any last comments before we move on to the next item? So let's move on to item number 9, Commissioners' Reports. Discussion and possible action on Commissioners' Reports on topics not covered by another item on this agenda, meetings with public officials, oversight and observation activities, long-range planning for Commission activities and areas of study, proposed legislation which affects elections. Okay, would anyone like to start?
Would you like to start with yours?
Sure, I'll start. I've got a number of things. So first, I started engaging with the digital services team in San Francisco. They're a department basically, and they're trying to switch over all the different commissions' websites to their new system. And it kind of has a new look, and it's a newer version of the software. So it's looking like they want that switch over to happen in mid-November. So it's something that I'm working with them on, and I just want to kind of give you a heads up. And I'll keep you posted on that. So another thing is on yesterday, the Secretary of State had their public comment hearing on the regulations that they submitted. And I did give a comment on that. We were limited to 3 minutes. And there was about an hour's worth of commenters. A lot of them were from the California Clean Money Campaign. And to the issue that was asked earlier, the main 2 comments that were provided by a lot of the people, including myself, were to make it less burdensome to apply for a pilot. Like in the draft regulations, you basically have to provide all of the same information that you would have to provide if you wanted to get certified. And it's like hundreds of pages of documents, a lot of work. And the feeling from...
Okay, thank you.
Whoever's talking, you're not muted. And then the second comment was that the let's see, yeah, basically to give more flexibility in allowing for when the software would be finalized prior to the election. I think there was a desire that there be allowed to have some kind of opportunity to respond to feedback from the department as the election approaches. So I think we'll find out within the next 30 days or so whether the Secretary of State adopts any of those suggestions. Another update is that Voting Works, who is the nonprofit that we were hoping to do the pilot with this November, as Mr. Turner mentioned earlier, I learned that in New Hampshire, they're going to be doing the election for 3 different jurisdictions, which is kind of exciting. So my understanding is that the Secretary of State of New Hampshire recruited these 3 jurisdictions, so they're going to be using Voting Works to tabulate their ballots in November.
Is that all ballots or is it a pilot?
It's all the ballots for those 3 jurisdictions. Yeah, so it's not just a pilot. And one of the things Voting Works did was they got approved by their Secretary of State. And then lastly, I attached a document to today's packet, which I started working on a document of the history of open source voting in San Francisco, which goes back many years. And I thought it would be a good way for, so we don't lose a record of what's happened on this, before, even before my time. So I wanted to kind of write this document while I'm still on the commission. And so for people who feel they might not have a good understanding of what's gone before, I would recommend taking a look at it. I think it would be a good starting point, and I'd like to expand this document over time. So those are my updates.
I think it would be beneficial to include this. Obviously, it's included as a packet item, but I think it would be beneficial to include this attachment on the website more noticeably, on the commission website more noticeably, just so that we don't lose track of it, because we do have 2 vacancies, and this conversation is not going anywhere. So
Yeah, you mean you're referring to the document I provided?
yes, the open source voting history in SF at a glance.
Yeah, certainly. My thinking was that, when I'm finished with the document, we could consider, kind of like voting on it and having it as a standing record of things. And we could even do that for other topics too. So,
Like redistricting.
yeah, exactly.
I actually had a question about your document. On page 3, where it says 1.68 million amount San Francisco allocated to open source voting between 2016 and 2018. What did that go toward specifically?
Yeah, so it went, I think, was it 150,000 or 300,000 that went to the consulting firm, Slalom? I think it was 150,000. Yeah, so 150,000 went towards the consulting firm to write one of the analyses that's mentioned in one of the other items.
Mhm.
And then some of the money went towards hiring a technical lead that the Department of Technology had hired, who was there for like a year and a half. And then, but really about most of that money, like $1 million of it was basically taken away during the pandemic. So
Right. There you go. I wonder if we could maybe incorporate that somewhere, or maybe not in this document,
Yeah.
and just say what was removed, because $1 million is pretty significant.
yeah, that's right. That's right. And there's a lot of history that's not there. So, but yeah, good point.
Thanks for putting this together.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, I like the idea of maybe having a section on our website on kind of our key initiatives. So I think this is clearly one. It's been going on for a long time, as we can see from your history here, as well as the redistricting initiative is another one. I'm sure we'll have more. I just have a quick update. Commissioner Stone and I attended a couple of events recently, including the W Challenge. And then yesterday we were both at the Ignite the Vote press conference to encourage young women and girls to pre-register and get registered to vote in recognition of National Voter Registration Day. Mayor Breed did speak at the event, and I just want to let my fellow commissioners know that I did remind her that we are still missing her appointee on this commission, which she acknowledged. And she said it was hard, and she has a couple of candidates, and, you know, she did say, she said, I know you don't have an African American. I said, yes, we do. So, so she is working hard on adding diversity to our commission and has been reminded.
Oh, great work.
I have a couple of updates I wanted to share. I have been, and I kind of touched on this earlier, I've been looking specifically at turnout and participation. In 2019, former election commissioner, had worked with a graduate student from actually my alma mater, and looking at different components of turnout in the city. And I really I've started to kind of engage community groups a little bit more on that. So specifically, I'd mentioned Urban Habitat, which works with communities to train folks who are, historically underrepresented, marginalized, to serve on commissions and in leadership positions. But then also I had spoken with PLS Director Arntz as well, that I wanted to share just to learn more about the inner workings of their work. PLS is Prisoner Legal Services. So I had spoken with them and looking at, and I also spoke with other communities that are hopefully going to connect me with folks that are supporting the unhoused and other system impacted folks to look at turnout. One of the biggest reasons that this is a priority is just, as Director Ernst kind of called out, in our old districts, there was a pretty significant gap in turnout, and it was consistent. So looking at those communities a little bit deeper by talking to community groups. And then the last thing I wanted to mention as it pertained to what Commissioner Dye had said, I actually wanted to mention that the Department of the Status of Women just launched a program on civic engagement and participation, and I'm going to be meeting with the program manager to discuss that, specifically about young people and the work they're doing to the work that the DOSW is doing to get the 18 plus vote turned out, since that's very, very low turnout. Actually, San Francisco has pretty low turnout compared with other Bay Area counties as well, but more to come.
Okay, thank you. So anything else to report? So let's, and Commissioner Barnholtz, did that answer your question about the regulations? Okay. Okay, let's take public comment on item number 9, Commissioners' reports.
Okay, so we have Mr. Phil Pell who would like to comment. And you are unmuted and you are commenting on the commissioner's report.
Great, thanks, David Pilpel again. So to President Jordanic, on the website cutover date and discussions with digital services, I'm aware as well that they are interested in migrating things to their new platform. I have never been a fan of the sf.gov structure. It's too sans serif and too much white space and all of that. But whatever, if that's going to happen eventually, then that's going to happen. I think there should be some discussion about the structure, because I think there's an opportunity to change some of the structure and make things a little more intuitive. And I would most strongly encourage that no change like that happen to the website until the November election is finalized, certified, sealed, and delivered. If there's any contest or whatever, recount, anything after the fact, that nothing happened to the website until after that. I think the last thing you would need if there's any controversy related to the election is for there to be a change to the website so that people can't find the news and the updates and whatnot. I think that's, yeah, that would, yeah. Anyway, you can talk to them about that. I appreciate the by the numbers history on open source voting. If you do post the history, I would be sure to highlight the date that you compiled that report, because it'll only be actions up to that date. On one of the pages, there are Board of Supervisors file numbers. Let me find that. Oh, it's page 1. Just to be sure, on items 1 and 2 in that box, you've got it listed as file 70865 and 81227. I think those have preceding zeros because those are all 6 digits. So it's 070865 and 081227. The rest look right to me. And just finally, on the question of the 1.68 million, perhaps it wouldn't be too hard in that box on page 3 to have a little bulleted list of how much went to actual activities and how much was released or returned to the general fund. That's probably not too many bullets.
30 seconds?
Okay. Thank you. Hope that's helpful. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Popo.
Mr. Turner would also like to comment. And Mr. Turner, you're unmuted and you're commenting on the commissioner's report. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Martha. And thanks to all the commissioners. By way of background here, also, I want to just throw a few names out that come out of the late 1980s, 90s, which is Ronnie Duggar, Duggar, Henry Brady from UC Berkeley, and a fellow by the name of Alan Deckert with Open Voting Consortium. These people were all doing the lead up work on open source voting and had solution right around 2000. So you may ask, what's taken 23 years on this? And basically, it's the pushback of corporate lobbyists working within the system to keep open source at bay. They find it a direct threat to their shareholder interest, and of course, their political ties are not unknown. I want to thank Mr. Jordanek for all the work here and getting into detail. And I wanted to address something that was said about there being a boogeyman that's going to come gobble us up if we get the systems that New Hampshire is now running in San Francisco. That is, for lack of a better term, BS. That's a Microsoft throwaway line again, that if you move toward open source, and I see some of you shaking your heads that may have associations with Microsoft and other corporate interests. The boogeyman theory has been dispelled by the Department of Defense, as well as the Air Force and NASA. So it's really incumbent upon the commissioners that are paying attention to this issue to know that when somebody comes forward and says, watch out for open source, it's got a little twist to it that will bite you at the end. We refer people to the Department of Defense on that issue. Other than that, regarding the 1.68 million, that was a fiasco and a shame that money wasn't utilized properly. But at least we're not as bad as Los Angeles County that burned through 300 million in their attempt moving toward open source systems and still failed for the same reasons that corporate interests entered the scenario in Los Angeles and tanked that particular effort. So there's a lot here other than what meets the eye superficially.
30 seconds.
Thank you. And I appreciate everybody going that extra mile to protect our democracy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Turner.
And we also have Daniel Dibler. You are unmuted and you have 3 minutes to comment on the commissioner's report.
So I definitely would like to say that I think that the big initiatives that you guys are working on should be more prevalent on the website, not just buried in kind of the notes or the agenda. So I love that idea of the open source voting and some of the other things that are being worked on by the commission being a little bit more prevalent on the website. So I will echo David's suggestion that you wait until the election results are completely done before you change where the website goes or that kind of stuff, because that's just it's easier in terms of people who are actually watching your website. And then I actually primarily want to respond a little bit to Mr. Turner, which is I'm not trying to give you kind of like the big tech oh my God, open source is so terrible. Like I said, I use open source software in so many of the projects that I work on. It's an amazing, um, it's an amazingly great gift that people have that are out there, that basically you're not solving the same problems over and over again, and you're working with a community of people who are basically trying to do the same thing that you are. They're trying to keep it safe. It is more just making sure you have somebody who understands, who's watching essentially CVEs that are associated with that software, and you're on the list where you get it before you get it, before the embargo date, and you can apply those patches when you need to do it. Like it's a matter of making sure that systematically you have a way to respond and follow those types of things, versus in the closed source world where you do have that because you're a customer at that point in time, right? In the open source world, it's a little bit different, but it's a mentality shift. It's not necessarily that it's bad or good. So I still kind of, I guess, maybe say the same caution, like have somebody who understands cybersecurity, who follows the open source community, hire that person and have that person work in the Department of Elections so that they're there to combat misinformation, right, that comes out about open source voting systems that says that they're bad, but they're not really bad. They're actually fine. There's not a current threat. And have someone who really understands the software at a granular level to be able to make that happen. So it's more
30
about
seconds.
it's more about resourcing yourself in the right way than it is about saying there's a boogeyman that's out there. And I'm done. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Steibler. Okay, are there any other commenters?
No, I don't see any other hands raised.
Okay, so any other comments? Okay, so before we move on to the next item, I had the suggestion that we, and I want to discuss this with all of you, skipping ahead to the last item, redistricting process initiative, since we have our speakers here, and we were hoping to get to this item, by now or so. So how do people feel about that? Yeah? Okay, well, let's do that then. Let's move to,
So actually, Ms. Craig had texted me that she is running a little bit late, although I had expected her by now. I wonder if you want to just take the agenda items for future meetings and
sure,
and
let's
after that.
do that. We'll do, let's move to agenda item number 10, agenda items for future meetings, and then we'll skip ahead. So, so who would like to start on this item? Or
I guess I'll start. As I mentioned this in our racial equity agenda item, I'd like to include a agenda item on equity, but also calling it diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice. That is kind of the present nomenclature. So if we can have that as an agenda item for the next meeting, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Anyone else?
As usual, I'd like to have the redistricting initiative in its normal spot as well.
Okay. Yeah, on that point, one thing I wanted to kind of throw out there is, would given that we have, a fair amount of time on this issue, like, how would people feel about trying to maybe dedicate like no more than 30 minutes of that topic to each meeting? Is that?
Yeah, I was going to ask about that as well. Just mostly because I was a little bit nervous about the length of today's meeting, specifically as it pertains to making sure we got through the long election plan. And so one thing I was thinking about is concerns around the next meeting, if it's capped at 30 minutes, knowing that the community groups and the clerk were supposed to come, will they be, like, I would hate, as someone who really wants to hear from the community, I really want to ensure neither group is abbreviated. And so is it possible to, unfortunately, ask one of them to move to a future meeting, whether, either one, but I just don't want either group specifically to feel that they have to be shortened.
Yeah, I think it'll be okay. So this is not, the next meeting is not the kind of full-blown, community testimony that we had talked about. So we've asked for one speaker representing the Unity Coalition. That was the only coalition that put together a legally compliant map. And we've asked Angela Calvio, the clerk of the board. She has assured us that she will only have 3 minutes to basically summarize the, I think, 8-page report that she had put together. So I think what it mostly is to allow us as commissioners to ask them questions. And then I do believe that we should separately schedule public hearings that are outside of our regular meetings after the election. So I think we'll be okay with half an hour next time.
Commissioners, if I may, just for just your consideration purposes for future planning and scheduling, depending on what happens in November with the ballot measure regarding elections, there may not be any elections next year, and you will have a lot more time to do more things because there won't be any elections if that ballot measure passes. So just for consideration that you don't have to squeeze everything in the fall, potentially.
Yes, actually, President Jordanic had pointed that out. And of course, it depends on the will of the voters, but if that does pass, we will probably have extra time to work on whatever we may or may not want to recommend for reform or redistricting. So I think half an hour is fine.
Okay, great.
And Ms. Craig is here, so.
Okay. So, Vice President Stone, does that,
Sorry, I'm not used to being called that.
did that
Yes.
settle the thing about the
Yes,
speakers for
yeah,
the next?
yeah.
Okay. Okay, so let's take, and also one of the other topics that has been mentioned in past meetings was doing a review for our secretary. That's something that is in our bylaws, so we're going to hopefully get to that maybe at the next meeting. And then, yeah. Okay, so let's take public comment on this item number 10, agenda items for future meetings. And then we're going to, just to remind everyone, we are going to be moving to the redistricting after this.
So we do have a caller on the line. I will unmute you, caller, and you are commenting on items for the future?
Yes.
You are.
Can you hear me now?
You have 3 minutes. Yes.
Great. David Pilpel, wandering around on the phone now for a moment. On the issue of future agenda items, whether it's listed on the agenda or just captured in the minutes, I still think it's useful to have kind of a list of both standing items and things that you're thinking about in the next, 3 to 6 or 6 to 12 months, just so that we can all sort of understand what's in the queue, and if there's a specific idea that the April meeting should include blah blah blah. There are certain things that work on a calendar, including the budget approval in January and February and things like that. So just kind of either laying out a whole year, or at least laying out those items that commissioners have raised or need to happen on a particular cycle may be useful for planning. That's all. However you handle it, up to you, but I just think it would be good to have some kind of an advance or forward calendar. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Popo.
Okay. That's it. We don't have any other hands raised.
Okay, then let's move on to, we're going to skip one item and move on to agenda item number 12, Redistricting Process Initiative. Discussion and possible action regarding the Commission's potential recommendations with respect to the San Francisco redistricting process, including historical background in the proposed project plan. So I will turn this over to Commissioner Dye to lead this item and introduce our speakers.
Thank you very much, President Jordanic. So today, as promised at the last meeting, we will be featuring a panel with representatives from the past 3 redistricting task forces. Hard to believe we've had 3. But before we do that, I want to just quickly go over some of the attachments that were included as part of the agenda packet. Starting with the follow-up information from the July meeting. Mr. Pilpel had actually requested the written remarks and notes from our 2 guest speakers last time. So we have collected that here, including Ms. Craig's presentation remarks, which she was able to retrieve from the cloud, and also our speaker from Common Cause, Alessandra Lozano. She provided her notes that went along with the PowerPoint that was provided last time. And also, as a follow-up, we requested the redistricting database that they had put together. As you may recall, they had monitored 60 city and county jurisdictions for the last redistricting cycle on local redistricting. And so if you've had a chance to look at that, I think you'll find it's interesting to know that in California, that 37% of the population is covered by an independent commission like we have in San Francisco. And from a county perspective, less so at the city level, only 11% of the population is covered at the city level by an independent commission. But there's a lot of interesting information in that database. The other things here, I've included the bios of our speakers, so I'm not going to go into gross detail about their impressive backgrounds, and you can look at them on your own. I've also included here the final reports of all 3 redistricting task forces, including the most recent one, which was posted at the July meeting. So with that, I would like to invite our 3 speakers to come forward. We only have 1 mic, so you'll have to take your turns. Let me first introduce very briefly Ms. Gwen Craig, who addressed us last time in her role as chair of the Elections Task Force, but she was also chair of the very first redistricting task force in 2001, 2002. And then we also have with us Myung Lee, is it Lee? Lee, who was a member of the 2011, 2012 Redistricting Task Force. And finally, we have Mr. Raynell Cooper, who was one of our appointees to the most recent Redistricting Task Force. And so with that, I am going to go ahead and start with some questions I asked them to prepare the answers for. So we'll go in order. Ms. Craig, if you want to come forward to the mic. The question for all 3 of you is give us 1 highlight and 1 low light of your time on the redistricting task force. Ms. Craig, please.
Okay. I actually have fond memories of the district hearings that we held to hear the San Franciscans' concerns and their desires about how their neighborhoods would fare in the redistricting process. I know there are probably a lot of people that comes as a surprise, but we learned a great deal about the history of parts of San Francisco, both the old and the new residents. I recall the stories in particular of the residents of the Portola or Portla neighborhoods, according to who you ask, we found out, whose family had lived there for generations, and also from residents of the newly relocated San Francisco residents who had settled in a neighborhood being called South Beach. And they both cared just as much, whether they were old or new, about what was going to happen to their neighborhoods and who they would be aligned to. So it was the sincerity and passion about their neighborhoods that came from those two particular neighborhoods in particular, but we heard that replicated from so many of the neighborhood residents at the community hearings, and they were very touching and moving, and they influenced me in particular a great deal.
Any lowlights?
The lowlights, unfortunately, came from working with the task force itself. The residents and the neighborhood advocates came with such sincere passions that it was such a disappointment when I came to realize that some of our task force members had underlying agendas that did not match the mission of our task force. I had become so accustomed to the task force from before that I had chaired, who we had such collegiality and unanimity that now we had this great split. You'll notice that our votes were mostly 5-4. And the 4 were the mayoral appointees, and one of the election commission appointees that was a holdover from when the mayor actually was running the elections department. So that was before the elections commission got seated. And, it was the divisiveness and the politicization of the task force that was really a letdown. And so that was a low light for me. And it was a real disappointment.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Craig. Mr. Lee, what was a highlight and a low light for you during your cycle?
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you all commission members and everyone here for this important discussion. I appreciate the opportunity to reminisce a little bit. It's been a long time since the task force that I served on did its work. But I will say that, as Ms. Craig said about the highlights that she said, that she mentioned in the original inaugural task force, very similarly in 2011 and 2012, we heard a great deal of very valuable, nuanced, specific, insightful comments from all quarters of the city and county of San Francisco, and that greatly influenced, or I would even say, was the predominant factor in shaping our thinking and our ultimate recommendations and the boundaries, of course. And to maybe sneak in a second highlight, I will say in our experience, we did have a very cohesive process and tone and tenor among the members of the task force. I'm sure we'll get into some of the specific details underneath that, but we approached our work in a very conscientious way. We were really well supported by Director Arntz and his team, the city attorneys, the deputy city attorneys whom we worked with, the consultants, the members of the staff of the clerk of the Board of Supervisors. Everyone worked really, really hard for a long period of time. And in our case, I'm happy to say that although we were 7 individuals and had different ways of thinking about the questions at hand, we did manage to have very respectful conversations, and in my view, we approached it from a very responsible and respectful intention.
And the low light?
The low light, it was hard for me to really identify a specific low light. I will say, as I'm sure everyone here knows, it's a big time commitment. So for any member to serve on this task force in the future, that's not something to be taken lightly. In our task force's iteration, we spent, I couldn't even hazard a guess as to how many hours we spent from beginning to end, and so it was mostly enjoyable, but not to be taken lightly.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Lee. Mr. Cooper, I bet he can beat you on the time.
Yeah, totally. Thanks so much. And yeah, I got to go last this time. I guess thank you all for inviting me. I have much shorter responses prepared, but very similarly, the highlight was getting to hear from hundreds of San Franciscans about their communities, learned so much. Unfortunately, didn't get a chance to go out as much as the other task force because of COVID, but still great. The low light I have was politics getting in the way of government. I know that's a big, the big crux of what you're trying to fix, and excited about that. So more to come on that, I'm sure, later tonight.
Why don't you stay up here and I'm going to ask you the next question. We'll go in reverse order.
There we go.
So the past redistricting cycle was notable both for the small number of task force candidates and questions about political influence. Most other jurisdictions, as we learned in the last couple of meetings, comply with California's Fair Maps Act, which was passed in 2019, which prohibits elected officials with a conflict of interest from appointing members to the redistricting body. So would you share who you were appointed by, and did you observe any differences in opportunity, qualifications, allegiances, or factions formed based on your appointing authority and those of the others?
Thanks. Yeah. So I was appointed by you all, by the Elections Commission. All of my colleagues were qualified, and I wouldn't say there were differences in opportunity or qualifications along appointing body lines. With few exceptions, though, across the many votes we took, if we weren't unanimous on a given vote, the mayor's appointees and the other two Elections Commission members voted together, and then the Board of Supervisors appointees would vote together, with myself voting often with the Board of Supervisors appointees, but sometimes with the mayor's appointees. Not going to hazard a guess exactly to the reasons that split happened, but there clearly was a pattern there.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Who would like to go next and answer that question? Who are you appointed by, and did you notice any differences in opportunity,
Yes.
qualifications, allegiance, or factions?
Thank you. So in my case, I think I can keep my response pretty short. I was appointed by Mayor Edley. And again, this was a while ago, but I don't recall really discernible patterns of influences, decisions, contributions to the discussions between the members that were appointed by in each of the three ways that are outlined in the city charter.
Okay, great. Ms. Craig?
I was appointed by the Elections Commission. It was the first commission, and it had just come into existence, and everything was a little bit rushed, but that's how I was appointed. And there were 3 by the Board of Supervisors and 3 others by the mayor.
And did you notice any differences or factions that were formed based on appointing authority?
Yes, definitely. The mayor's appointees definitely seem to work as a group. And as I mentioned before, the elections director, before the Elections Commission had been seated, had made 3 appointments. And once she actually was removed before the Elections Commission, or around the same time that the Elections Commission was seated. And there was an argument about whether her commission should stand. They wound up keeping one of them. And that one, that was the holdover. She always sided with the mayor's appointees. Okay. So she was sort of a holdover as a mayor's appointee in essence, because he ran the elections department prior to the Elections Commission coming on. So those who were aligned with the mayor always voted as a block, always seemed to sort of caucus as a block and that sort of thing.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to answer the next question. What basic qualifications do you think all redistricting task force members should have, and what might vetting look like?
I struggle with that. I know that residency in San Francisco is very important. How long it should be is what I struggled with, because I think you need to have lived here for some great duration of time, at least. I don't think you can have lived here, for example, for 2 years and immediately serve on a body that's deciding on the neighborhoods of San Francisco and how they should stay together or be aligned with others or that sort of thing. Is 5 years enough? It's a difficult question, I think. And I think a long-term time in the city is a very helpful qualification. And perhaps, there could be some balancing. If someone has lived here 5 years but has been engaged in activities that give them a greater understanding of our city and its neighborhoods, versus someone who's lived here 20 years and also, maybe had not had as much of that activity. Perhaps there could be some sort of weighting on that sort of thing. So residency, 5 to 20, you get a weight for this sort of thing and that. Maybe something like that could be developed. So you wouldn't be ruled out unless you had X number of years, but you could be weighted based on this.
Anything else besides residency?
Well, I think it would also help to have been engaged in some way in the civic life of our city. I found it had been helpful for me to have an understanding of how these districts played into, what was going to happen in the application to working on campaigns, doing voter registration, how this was going to make a difference to how people voted, whether it was going to impact them positively or negatively. Something that gave people some understanding of that could also perhaps be given a grid. So if people had in some way engaged in the civic life in some way of the city, I think that if they belong to, civic organizations in some way, that gave them some understanding of that, I think that would be helpful and could be a part of the process that was weighted.
Okay, great. Mr. Cooper, do you have any thoughts on qualifications, basic qualifications that all members should have and what vetting might look like?
Sure. Yeah. So I think besides being a San Francisco resident and a demonstrated interest in the civic well-being of the city, I don't know if there's anything that I could think of that I would really call a basic qualification. I do think that there, depending on how the process looks, could be room for more in-depth airing and discussion and understanding of candidates' political pasts and proclivities. Though I'm of the opinion that it's possible to compartmentalize those, that someone can have political opinions and then still be able to separate them when they work and when they're on a body like the Elections Commission or Redistricting Task Force or something that civil servants do every day, like myself. I think it's a matter of trying to understand why someone is choosing to get involved. Do they want the best process possible? Are they there for political ends? I don't know if that's possible to fully suss that out in a vetting process, but perhaps more effort could be done by the appointing authorities to understand some of that.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but for example, the CRC, there was a requirement that you had to be impartial.
Yeah, I think having, how you define that and how you figure that out can be very difficult. And I think, I think having a requirement of impartiality, I think is I think an important first step. But I think figuring out how to get that there is a little bit tougher.
All right, Mr. Lee, did you have some thoughts on basic qualifications?
Like Ms. Craig and Mr. Cooper both said, I think it's a tricky question. I'm not sure what the perfect answer is to this. I do think that it would be important to not impose a filter that was too restrictive so that you would disqualify otherwise appropriate candidates from being considered. I wonder if maybe a commitment to abide by the to honor and respect the criteria that are established by the group, or to commit to disclosures of potential conflicts or something like that might be helpful. But I think, as Mr. Cooper said, you'd want to consider the specific language very carefully.
Actually, none of you have talked about vetting. How would you think about vetting?
About vetting, well, may I ask, I know this is potentially a discussion that will go in different directions, but would you suggest that we contemplate the current processes that are
Whatever
outlined
you
in
think
charter?
it should be. We're taking open proposals for reform, so do not assume that the way it was is how it will be done in the future.
I see. Well, I do think a thought that occurs to me is when one goes through jury selection, there's a question that's posed to all potential jurors, which is, do you have the ability to be impartial and to listen to and consider evidence that's presented in front of you and honor and consider the instructions of the judge, et cetera. So those sound sort of general, but I think might be meaningful to this type of process, because I do think it is meaningful to hear guidance and direction like that, to think about it, and to self-declare whether one is able to commit to those types of standards.
Yeah.
And so even if it's slightly general or vague, I think making a declaration of certain of abiding by certain standards might be helpful.
Okay, I'm going to keep you up here to answer the next question. Do you believe your task force was broadly representative of the city's diversity, regardless of the diversity of the candidate pool, which no one had control over? Why or why not?
I do feel it was, in general, representative of the makeup of San Francisco as a whole. And I'm sure it's a 9-member body, so there are only so many views or experiences, lived experiences, that can be represented in a body of that size. But I think, given the constraints of the number of task force members, I think the appointing bodies collectively did a pretty good job.
So that leads to the next question, which is that the San Francisco's task force has fewer members than other large counties' bodies. For example, LA County has 14, and San Diego as well. Even the city of Long Beach and Berkeley have 13. Do you think increasing the number of members would improve representation?
I would think that a modest increase in the number of members would provide some more opportunities to make sure a critical set of constituents is not overlooked or omitted. I do, at the same time, understand that there are dynamics of efficient and orderly discussions that can be, there can be trade-offs between the size of a body and the efficient handling of discussions and meetings.
And another aspect of diversity, do you think a stipend or pay would improve diversity? This was all volunteer for all three of you.
Right. That's a hard question for me to answer. I don't have specifically strong opinions about that. I do think that, of course, it would stand to reason that offering some sort of stipend would make it more feasible for a wider group of people to participate in a process like this. The sort of policy part of my brain also wonders about that question broadly, as far as advisory bodies of the city and county, and that, I know that's not the question before you, but I'm sure that's something that many people would want to think through as well.
Okay, great. Ms. Craig, do you want to comment quickly on the same questions? Do you think that your task force was broadly representative of the city's diversity?
I think we were fairly diverse. I think for a body of our size, it was diverse. I think it would have been improved, and that having bodies of large size would help, definitely.
Okay.
I think that in particular, the Asian and Latino communities could stand with greater representation of the various varieties of communities within those populations.
Okay, great. Any comment on the stipend or pay question?
I think the stipend would definitely help. I think it should be modest. You know, people tend to get kind of ornery about, oh, you people are getting paid. That sort of thing.
It's public service, right?
It is public service, and it is long hours, and it's tedious, and you stay late, and it's, you know, it's hard to justify to people who aren't used to that sort of thing. So a stipend would definitely help.
Okay, great. And Mr. Cooper, do you have anything further to add on your task force? Do you feel like it was broadly represented, and how did
I do feel like it was diverse along just about every measure I could think of, with the exception of geographic. I think that was one of the weaknesses, though some members had connections in other areas of the city. By the start of our work, all 9 of our members lived in the eastern half of the city, broadly defined, and 8 of them living in the northeast quadrant of the city, more or less. So I think we could have used a little more geographic diversity. I know with 3 different appointing bodies, it's really hard to nail that down. On the question of size, I think it would provide an opportunity for more diversity of ideas and geographies. I don't think it's necessarily necessary, especially considering we're a lot smaller in scale than LA County and a lot of these other places, though most people will have a better understanding of the city generally, I think. So, but I think it would certainly be helpful. And as with the stipend, I do think it would be helpful. It's definitely also the right thing to do. It's a lot of labor and a lot of time went into it. So I think that would help improve diversity, but also I think the right thing to do.
Okay, I'm going to ask you the next question. Common Cause last time recommended that San Francisco move to an open, competitive selection process with protections against conflicts of interest, which as used by almost all newer bodies, instead of political appointments. If adopted, how do you think this would change future redistricting task force?
Yeah, I think an open competitive process would be an excellent step forward. In this past cycle, the Elections Commission process was largely open with the open applications that you could all read, and an open, mostly open process to the extent it could be. But I think even then we still could have had a better understanding of the criteria being used to select us. But then you talk about the Board of Supervisors and the mayoral appointment processes, and those were wholly opaque, even I think to some of those people being appointed by those authorities. And I think that that's something that should not be repeated. I also think adding a randomizing aspect, much like I think Oakland and some other cities have, would also help, where they select a large body and then they randomly select from that pool. I think while the Elections Commission is certainly neutral, and you guys are doing an excellent job of impartiality at the end of the day, especially thinking about the last administration in DC, thinking about places where norms can fall apart, and at the end of the day, the Elections Commission is entirely appointed by elected officials or elected bodies, and I think from a systemic standpoint, it seems like a vulnerability, and it would be helpful to add another layer of impartiality there.
Okay, thanks. And Ms. Craig, you had a contentious cycle as well. Do you think that an open competitive selection process with protections against conflicts of interest would have changed things?
I think it may have. Our first body seemed, that it had not been influenced by the appointing bodies at all. And then when I saw how it could in the second body that I had belonged to, chaired, I saw how that was a real potential danger that had come to life. So it seemed that really needed to be avoided. Okay. And so I think that the Common Cause recommendation is a good one.
Okay, great. And Mr. Lee, did you have any thoughts on that?
I don't have any reasons to think that a open process would be a detrimental direction in the future. All I can say is that in the task force that I served on, I did not, and I would guess that this is a view that's shared by other members of that task force, but of course I don't really know for sure. I personally did not feel like the lack of a competitive process hindered the effectiveness of the task force that I served on.
Of course, you had the one that actually worked collegially together. So,
Correlation.
let me ask you the next question on onboarding and training. Given that there are no specific qualifications to serve currently, what kind of training did you wish you and your colleagues had or had more of before you started work?
I will say, again, I might be the sort of minority in terms of the experiences across the three task forces, but I will say that in my recollection, we started reasonably early, and we received very important onboarding and training, both about legal issues, the city charter, the criteria that we were instructed to consider, and in fact, in some respects, design. And at a later stage, we also received some training about how to utilize the software that was available at that time for modeling different options for drawing boundaries and the resulting changes in population, et cetera. So I feel like in our task force, we received the appropriate information, guidance, tutorials, et cetera. There were some aspects of the process and timing that were constrained, but I think they had more to do with community outreach and gathering input from the public, as opposed to building our own awareness of the parameters we were supposed to follow.
Okay, and Mr. Cooper, what about you? Do you feel like there was more, training or more training that you would have liked to have seen more of?
I think we had a good amount of training on a lot of the technical and a lot of the legal components. I think one thing is I wish we had a bit better understanding of the best practices in terms of interpreting and receiving, eliciting public input. We got so much public input, and we didn't really, and this gets into a lot of the criteria stuff we'll talk about a little bit later, but we didn't really have a cohesive way of understanding it and thinking about it. There was all sorts of kind of muddiness and a lack of clarity around the various COVID policies. Hopefully 2031 not dealing with that, but I think, we could have, a lot of those policies kind of changing and buried in these very kind of convoluted memos from the mayor's chief of staff, and it's wanted a little bit more clarity on that. I think my wishes around this category are kind of less about training and more about staff support. Definitely not the fault of the clerk of the board staff or the elections department staff, but who all did their duties great, and city attorney's office as well. But I think the framework around the outreach and the timelines, there's a lot of things that either could have been done earlier, or perhaps if we had a longer time period done ourselves in those first few months as a body. Things like having a schedule set, when we start, and not having to spend 3 months figuring out our own schedule. Things like that would have been a little bit more helpful.
Okay, and Ms. Craig, was there any training that you wish you had or had more of?
We had been very lucky with our first task force that was not redistricting, to have consultants and so forth that had been provided to us. And when we came into the redistricting task force that I chaired, we found ourselves unsupported. We did have support from the city attorney's office on just sort of coaching us on the rules of the road and that sort of thing. But we sort of had to stand on our own in developing how our process was going to go. We did have an excellent consultant in Bruce Kane in doing all of the mapping and all of the technical work. So we didn't need really guidance on how to develop what we were hearing, the recommendations, and developing that into putting that on the paper, on the map. But I think we really could have benefited a little bit more on having help with doing the outreach, doing proper advertising, doing beyond advertising in newspapers and finding other ways to utilize alternate media. So that's, I think, what was lacking in our task force.
Okay, great. Please stay here. So the charter actually only specifies compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act, population equality within 5%, and respecting communities of interest as redistricting criteria. In contrast, the Fair Maps Act includes ranked standard criteria, which is also used by the state Citizens Redistricting Commission. Thinking back on your mapping process, would more specific or rank-ordered criteria help you make better decisions in the line drawing process? Why or why not?
I'm not really certain that it would. But I don't have a clear understanding of their ranked order process. And I'd like to, understand a little bit more about where that's been used and how. But I think I find it very intriguing and compelling and worthy of study, definitely. I think we have had, we have the ability to do redistricting here under our present process and do it successfully. I think if we can do it with less political interference, then we don't have a lot of difficulty with what we're doing and that we can do it well. But I've learned that we can benefit greatly from looking at new processes and finding ways that we might improve, not because we're broken, but because there is a way that we can do it better. And I think it's very worthy for this body to take up looking into that.
So would you propose any specific definitions of standard redistricting criteria? For example, what constitutes a community of interest, or alternative criteria that San Francisco might consider to better design districts for the purposes of fair and effective representation?
Well, when I had to go back and read how we define communities of interest, I was actually quite impressed because I think that's a very difficult definition to grapple with. And I can't think of any further criteria that we can put into that. I think, though, it is worthy of having more community input into that question, in particular into communities that are sort of non-traditional communities that we might not think of in thinking of that word community. I think we need to think of the disabled community, the transgender community, those that have not been thought of in the past as to why they might need to congregate in geographic locations, and what are the needs that must be met for them to be in the same supervisorial districts. And so I think it's worthy of taking community input on that question.
Okay.
And discovering new communities that we may not have thought of before.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Craig. Mr. Cooper, your thoughts on the specific and rank-ordered criteria?
Yeah, I think it would have helped insofar to have something like that would have helped insofar as it would have led to more productive discussions. I think as it was, all we had was what the public said and how we chose to consider that. In some situations, it was the question of breaking up one neighborhood versus breaking up another, and how do we decide that? And I think we each had our own ways. But even if we felt the outcome or a person's vote was wrong, as long as the numbers worked out and we respected communities of interest in some way, you couldn't really say within our framework whether something was right or wrong. It was just kind of all left up to opinion, and we had, without any sort of criteria, we didn't really have a common language with which to talk about these sort of things. I will say, though, that I think the rank standard criteria in the MAPS Act probably would not have helped all that much. I think a lot of that is sort of relatively basic and felt sort of like an extension of just the communities of interest criteria. So I think we would have had to have gone a little bit further to fully flesh out some of the questions around how you deal with those COI conflicts.
Is there specific alternative criteria that you think would have been helpful or definitions that would have been helpful?
Yeah, I think, let me just look back at the other question too. I think one thing that would have been helpful is to have, just some way of measuring and weighing COIs. I don't really know exactly what that would be, but I think it'd be, it's difficult to say that some are less important than the others, but at the end of the day, that's what we were doing. That was our job, and we didn't really have any sort of way to do that. Whether that's something that would come from the charter or that would be something that the body would kind of create and discuss on their own, I think is definitely something worth discussing. I think just an example, during our cycle, I made the statement that we heard from the Tenderloin wanting to be with West and Central Soma, and to me, I felt like that was based on my understanding of what our task was, that the needs of those communities to be together outweighed the needs of the other communities that would have had to be shifted around because of that. But others disagreed, and there really was no way for us to square that circle without having some way to talk about how we kind of view those communities of interests with each other. I also think that the one other thing in the charter that kind of helps, is meant to help kind of rein us in, is the adjustments as appropriate based on public input at public hearings, and turn that phrase over my head a bunch of times, but it's still very kind of vague. What is an appropriate adjustment, and how do we weigh all these points of input? If we feel like an adjustment is appropriate, but the majority of the comments are against it, 80%, all of it, there was really no guidance around that. Obviously, I don't think putting numbers on things is something that would be particularly helpful, but I do feel like that bit was a little bit vaguely described in the charter. So.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lee, do you have any thoughts on a rank ordered standard criteria?
In our task force, we actually established criteria, and they're summarized in
your report.
In our report.
Yeah.
And there's a whole section 2 of our report describes the criteria, and I am happy to say they map, so to speak, very well to the criteria that are mentioned, I think, in the
Fair Maps
Act. So that was really important for us to understand what we should be considering in general, and with respect to specific questions that we were grappling with. I really am struggling to remember whether we adopted a ranking of those criteria. They are numbered, there are 6 of them, but again, just memory has faded a little bit. So I'm kind of interested in this notion of applying, of how a ranked application or ranked approach would be applied to specific questions, because there's so many questions that have to be addressed all at the same time. And I can imagine that could be a little tricky because,
I can share that.
Okay.
We did use rank ordered at the state level, and it did break a lot of ties.
I see.
So it helped, eliminate a lot of discussion when there was clear ranking, but there were many that were ranked equally. So we had plenty of those kind of tie-breaking discussions ourselves. Did you have any thoughts on specific definitions that would be helpful in San Francisco's case, or alternative criteria that San Francisco would want to consider?
Well, I know the question of communities of interest in particular is a really important one for this work. And again, reacquainting myself with the work that our group did a decade ago, I found that we did establish some guidance to members of the public to identify for us what they thought of as communities of interest. So there is, as you know, there isn't a very specific definition in the charter. So there's a lot of room for interpretation or definition left to whoever has a point of view about this. And so the approach that we took was to invite members of the community to define for us, what is the community of interest as you see it? Why do you think, what are the geographic boundaries of the community of interest, and why do you or others in the community feel like it is an important thing to keep intact? And so that actually was really, really important in generating feedback for us to respond to and really reflect on.
Okay.
They knew best.
Great. So I'm going to ask you a couple of operations questions now. Some believe that truly independent commissions ought to be responsible for choosing their own consultants, like the California CRC, which hired its own staff, including everything from contract videographers, line drawers, racially polarized voting consultants, legal counsel. And others say it's too much of a burden for a temporary, citizen body to manage a budget and procurement processes, especially at the local level. How satisfied were you with the support and resources provided by the Department of Elections, the clerk of the board during your cycle, and what changes would you suggest to improve outcomes?
Right. So in our report, we did speak to some of these issues, and what I would, and this is speaking for myself as much as or more than other members of the task force, but I recall that given the time that we had to complete our work, that it felt quite important that a technical consultant had been identified and contracted with, and that was not an initial step that our task force had to undertake. We began our work in August of 2011, and we had about an 8-month deadline, April 15th, as I think everyone here knows, to complete the maps. And so if we had spent 4 to 6 weeks familiarizing ourselves with contracting procedures and vetting responses, et cetera, I think there's a tension there. And maybe one way to sort of draw a happy medium might be to make sure that members of the task force or the task force as a body could have as many interactions with the city and county staff or consultants as they saw fit to understand how a selection was made or to do some vetting along the way or some avenue to express concerns or questions about the performance of the scope of work in question. But I just would have had a hard time imagining starting with the selection of every member of the team that was important for that work. I will say, and we noted this in our report, there was a capacity constraint in terms of community outreach, which is a really important part of this process, as I know you know, and we, in some respects, had to again, this is my recollection, had to define our approach to community outreach as we were confronting the need to do the community outreach. So whether starting earlier with that or having some ideas or a bench of potential providers, providers of assistance that could be considered by the task force, I think that would have helped. I think we noted that, and I believe there was even a supplemental budget request along the way that the Board of Supervisors had to approve.
So speaking of deadlines and timeframes, the charter only specifies a final deadline for districts to be adopted. Did your group publish one or more official draft maps prior to the deadline? If so, how far in advance? Do you think the public had adequate time to respond and offer alternative solutions? And what additional deadlines do you think would have been helpful to achieve the goal of identifying, incorporating input from communities of interest?
Yes, I think this was really key to our process being successful. We had a public meeting, I believe, in December, in which there was a concept of a visualization, just conceptually showing up for the first time for members of the public to view what a visualization might look like. I think that was produced in December, primarily through the technical consultant. And then beginning in January, I believe we started sharing maps reflecting our own, at the beginning, very preliminary thinking, but as we iterated for the following 3 months, it got more and more specific, and we were doing line drawing in real time and in meetings from January through the second week in April, and that was really important.
Okay, great. Mr. Cooper, you had started to talk about support from other departments. Do you want to expand on those comments?
Sure. Yeah, I think the staff were excellent within the scope. Our mapping consultant, especially, I think was quite helpful along the way. I do think either too much was assigned to the task force to be responsible for, or perhaps that the leadership of our task force, with the various other constraints that we had, did not do as well of a job in terms of delegating tasks and understanding where we needed to be able to complete the mapping in a timely and complete manner. I think the most obvious example is the schedule. As I alluded to, we spent most of the meetings in October and November and December trying to hash out the schedule. And while there were different facilities aspects that kind of threw a wrench in that, I think by and large, it's one of the many things that could have been done beforehand. I think on the point of this question of is it a burden for the task force to do a lot of that? I think it is. I think having staff, whether that be clerk of the board staff, whether that be staff within the elections department, whether that be planners in the planning department, because I think this is kind of well within their sort of professional wheelhouse to help facilitate the contracts and facilitate the public outreach. I think whoever is in charge of that, I think there should be staff dedicated fully to that. Specifically on the contracts, I do think it probably would make a lot more sense to have the contracts kind of being run by the staff, but have that be not necessarily before, but concurrent to the process, so that the board does have final sign off on the contracts and understands. I think good parallels how it works at the SFMTA, where there's the staff does all the contracts and sits on all of the RFP panels and all that, and then they bring it to the board and they say, hey, this is what we came up with, and the board makes a final decision about that. I think something like that may work a little bit better. I think having that be a more public and transparent process than it was, I think would be helpful. And then
Deadlines before the final deadline?
deadlines, yes. So yeah, we did get a map out about a month. March 14th was when our first map hit public. I do think, earlier is better. Earlier would have been better. I would not say the public had adequate time to respond or offer alternative solutions. Definitely a lot of meetings to do that at least, but I think having a little bit wider of a window would be good. I would say I don't know if I think it necessarily needs to be in the charter, but history says it probably does need to be in the charter, that there is some other earlier deadline for a map. And the sort of the backstop of of having one 3 days before or whatever is, that's I think woefully insufficient. I think it would be good to have something in that 2-month, 3-month time frame out earlier than that. And then hopefully related to all of this, I think having a starting date, and I think that's definitely something I think that should go into the charter, is having a firm starting date. And I think, as somebody who follows housing in the city pretty closely, I can tell you that they're going to have to redistrict again, and we don't have to wait for the census. We're going to have to redistrict again in 10 years. And instead of leaving up to the mayor to determine when the task force starts based on when the census data comes in, saying, beginning January 1st, 2030 or something along those lines, I think would be majorly helpful to give a full year and change to talk about this, which I think is what it deserves. So
Great. Thank you. And Ms. Craig, your
I
comments?
just want to do a time check on this.
Yes, I have a quick, we're almost done here. So your comments on whether independent commissions ought to choose their own staff, and then timeframes and deadlines.
The first task force that I served on, we got to choose our own staff, and it worked out wonderfully. The redistricting task force that I served on, the Elections Commission, as I mentioned earlier, was just up and running. They were trying to get themselves organized. We didn't really receive any support from them, and that really did hurt us a bit. I remember our very first meeting was about who's going to take minutes? And it was never settled, really.
Yeah.
Or wasn't for a while. And the records are very poor on our task force because of that. So I think, that has to be settled. Assign staff to the task force. I think it's quite necessary, and I think it might work best if the task force could get to select such a person and settle those questions, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary.
Okay, could all three of you just come up real quick and answer this quick question? Currently, the redistricting task force requires only a simple majority to pass a map. Many other jurisdictions require a special majority or a supermajority vote. Would requiring increased consensus have improved your process? Why or why not? Real quick.
In our case, I don't think it would have improved our process.
Okay.
I'm not entirely sure, but I think we would probably still be meeting as a body if we had to try to get to, especially if we had to get to 7 or 8 or 9 votes on everything. So I would say it would have made things a little bit more difficult. But I think paired with a different appointment process, it could be good.
Okay, and then Mr. Lee?
In our case, I don't think it would have made a difference. We adopted our recommendations unanimously.
You're the golden child here.
For whatever reason, that was not an issue for us.
I think if it was a larger body, that might be worthy of consideration. But in our case, I don't think we could ever have achieved it if it was too small.
Okay. All right, great. I did have a couple more questions on accountability and transparency, but I wanted to let my fellow commissioners ask any questions that they might have.
Anybody?
I more just had a request, if that's okay. If there's anything outside of the panel questions that you would want to share with us as separate comments that were specific to your thoughts or feedback, we welcome that as well, outside of the formal commission meeting.
Any other?
I just want to thank all of you for coming, just very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Can I ask my last two questions? All right, I did have two questions on accountability and transparency, quick round robin questions. So nothing currently prohibits the redistricting task force members from having private meetings or discussions about redistricting or public votes early in the morning. You know what I'm talking about. What can be done to increase transparency and the public's trust? So bans, rules, practices, structure, anyone who would like to answer that question.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think a lot of it comes back to the criteria. I think having to fully explain and flesh out these decisions in a public forum should help. I think a lot of the late night stuff, a lot of that falls on there's a lot of it within the Brown Act, and a lot of other issues. And obviously, if the task force is doing its job, hopefully it doesn't mean 200 people filling a bunch of rooms here on the 4th floor. I think considering a ban on communications, I think definitely something worth considering. I also do wonder what the enforcement methods would look like on something like that and what the ramifications could be, and if members would be able to receive some sort of due process in a timely enough manner if something were to come up during the redistricting process.
And anyone else want to comment on that?
I think it's important to start early because you run into time delays you didn't anticipate, and a lot of the delay is having to give proper notice for meetings.
Yep.
And I think strict adherence to the sunshine laws and the open meeting laws has to be maintained, especially in San Francisco. We have people who are following those closely, and I think as they should be. When our body started, there was a big brouhaha because the Elections Commission had had a reception for one another without announcing that to the public or allowing the public to attend. And that was just a reception. And, but these things people feel are important. And so I think that that's something that everybody should strictly adhere to. And you just have to have it built into your schedule so that you have enough time to give those timely notices for gatherings.
And then finally, task force members currently serve at the pleasure of their appointing authority. Under what circumstances should a member be removed and replaced? I think Mr. Cooper will have a comment on that. And should qualified alternates be selected earlier in the process? And many cities require alternates to be chosen. Anyone?
I can go ahead. Yes. Yeah, I think first on the question of alternates, there should definitely be alternates, even if there isn't a removal. I think having, if someone drops off, being able to, fill someone in, I think is important. I definitely think there should be something, in that says why someone could be removed or how someone could be removed. I know that this is something that came up quite a bit, and I think the understanding being that that a body or the mayor or the board of supervisors could just pluck someone off. And I think while obviously that became most apparent for the elections commission's appointees, I think that was oftentimes, I think, even more perilous for the mayor and the board of supervisors appointees, because they would not be able to get a public process, perhaps. You never would really have known. And yeah, maybe if something different had happened, the mayor could have the next day, or the board of supervisors could have taken someone off directly with at least the elections commission. There had been some sort of hearing, but I think having some sort of standard, to me, I would think the standard would have to be relatively high, but I think it would have to match with whatever other sort of rules around accountability get thrown in there. But yeah, and again, I think there would have to be some sort of due process involved in all of that as well.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Mr. Lee.
If I can, this is sort of segueing back to the last question, if I can just read a short part of our report.
Sure.
I think it speaks to this theme. The task force's deliberations emphasized hearing and responding to public input related to neighborhoods, communities of interest, equalizing population, and other established criteria. The task force did not emphasize political considerations such as distribution of power among various political blocs or coalitions in the city. The relatively low level of political pressure or emphasis allowed the task force to be more responsive to community concerns that were more clearly related to its established charge. Future task forces would be well served by continuing this dynamic. So with respect to this question about, I don't have a strong opinion about removal. I think the idea of having alternates in case there is a need to replace or substitute a member, that seems to make a lot of sense for practical reasons. I would just say that having the ability for the task force in the future to continue to really work in tandem with the community, with the members of the community that come and express their own needs. It was a really important feature of the work that we did, and hopefully that can continue in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. So I know on the state redistricting commission, elected officials were not allowed to talk to us at all outside of a public meeting, and that made a huge difference. So I want to thank all of you again for taking time this evening to share your experiences with us. As I mentioned, we will be having dedicated public hearings to, let members of the community weigh in, come up with their own proposals. You guys are absolutely welcome to participate and comment on with the benefit of your experience. Does anyone else have anything else that they would like to ask our esteemed panel at this time?
Thank you for that.
Yeah, just thank you again. We should do the public comment now, though. Is it now okay? So let's take public comment on this item number 12, redistricting process initiative.
Okay, so we do have a caller on the line. It is Danielle Deibler. And you are unmuted and you have 3 minutes to comment.
So as a person who actually listened to a lot of the redistricting task force meeting that were going on, especially some of the ones that were going on to late in the evening. I definitely have to say I'm a huge proponent of giving some kind of a stipend or some kind of, I mean, these people worked a lot of hours, and just like the election commission does. So these public oversight commissions should have some, I think, type of compensation that is given to these people. Otherwise, you end up with a group of people who can afford to spend this much time, but you actually you disenfranchise a lot of people who maybe might want to be involved in local politics, and a lot of people who might really want to have a voice, but they can't have a voice because they can't afford to spend, I mean, redistricting, it was like, you can't afford to spend time in a 12-hour meeting. So I definitely support the stipend idea. The one thing I would kind of disagree with is I do think that some of the task force members would have done better with a little bit more education on the Voters' Rights Act, like what a community of interest was, something in the beginning that was a little bit more helpful to them in terms of being able to determine this type of, determine the ranked criteria. And that's where I think ranked criteria comes in. That is very useful to be able to understand, this is the ranked criteria, this is the thing that you need to actually do, and this is how you rank the things. Those things would have been actually, I think, very useful to that group. And the other thing I think, honestly, is choosing some of their own consultants, especially for community outreach, and also choosing some of the procedures that they used for quantitative analysis of public comment. So, a qualitative analysis is great. You heard the hearts and minds of people, but actually understanding how many people came and showed up at a meeting, and that's still something that's actually pretty. It's kind of a black box, right? How many people showed up and had one opinion versus another, and some
30
people showed up with
seconds.
maps that were actually quite usable, but didn't necessarily get really realistically considered by the commission. So that's my end of my comment. Thank you very much.
Okay, we do have another caller on the line, Fernando Marty, and you are commenting on the redistricting process initiative. You are unmuted and you have 3 minutes to comment.
Great, thank you. My name is Fernando Martí. I am now a resident of District 9. And wanted to thank you especially for this process and the questions that you presented to the panelists. I think a lot of upfront framing has been done through the questions that were posed, questions around how we ensure diversity through either stipends or compensation for transportation, childcare, and other things, the importance of impartiality in the composition of the redistricting task force, whether that is through some kind of randomized selection or other kind of selection that takes the mayor and board of supervisors out of that task force. How you guarantee against conflicts of interest through that, but also through other ways in which the task force members can guarantee that there won't be conflicts of interest. Clarity on the ranked criteria and how the task force members decide upon that, or if that's decided ahead of time. And as I think the other caller just said, around the necessity of education for those task force members. And lastly, maybe just around the timelines that task force members are required to take on, whether it's April or there's additional time, and how quickly the public can see the draft maps. So all those questions that were presented and that you all spoke about, I think are really important. It was really amazing having been involved in the 2010 or 2011 task force, and seeing that process closely, and then watching how different that was from this last year. That everything that we can possibly do to take those conflicts of interest and ensure an impartial task force will be really important for the next time around. So thank you again for this.
And we do have one more caller on the line. I believe it is Mr. Pell. You are unmuted and you have 3 minutes to comment on redistricting process initiative.
Great. Thank you again. So I appreciate the very thoughtful questions and answers. I will spend some time thinking about my views on the questions. I do agree that time and the ability to work collaboratively with others, particularly those with similar or different, including radically different perspectives, needs more attention and perhaps should be specific criteria for selection of members. On diversity, whether it's 9, 15, or some other number of members, I think roughly, and I emphasize roughly in thirds, since roughly a third of the city is Asian, probably a third-ish, I haven't checked recently, is Caucasian, and the rest, including Latino, Black, other, and mixed, are also roughly a third, and I may be a little off on that. Then I think that the membership of the body should be, again, roughly representative of that. As to age, I think over 62, 40 to 62, and 18 to 40, or again, roughly proportional to the diversity of the city in demographics. I think having no more than 2 members from each existing district would be a nice idea. I would think about sequencing the appointments to create the diversity so that you don't have the ability for the mayor to appoint and the board and this commission with no sequence of how that happens. And so whoever gets there first kind of gets there. I don't know how exactly to do that, but there may be ways to sequence the appointments. I think having some kind of hardcore political activists, some moderately involved folks, and some less involved people might help. I think not having all policy wonks would be great, and somehow getting less polarization would be good. I absolutely agree with Myung that our task force, although we had disagreements about occasional things, we were not particularly polarized. I think we worked well together.
30 seconds.
Thanks. And I think that was good. I mean, I agree with what was said. And finally, I think there are definite differences between technical and political aspects of the work, and having more advanced planning is definitely better. Happy to think more about this and share. Thanks for spending the last hour plus on this.
We do have one more caller on the line. Caller, you're unmuted and you have 3 minutes to comment on the redistricting process initiative.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I was being the last caller and hope I'm the last caller. I'm Jen Say with the Legal Women Voters San Francisco. I thought all the commenters that just gave public comment, I thought that those were very useful. I also wanted to just bring, I also really enjoyed, the interview with the task force members from, the past decades. I'm also curious, given the feedback that the public has just given, maybe there might be an opportunity to actually reach out to other jurisdictions from across the state of California that have implemented the Fair Maps Act or were Fair Maps Act compliant, especially, say, Oakland or San Diego or Long Beach. Just to kind of get an idea of I think, since the commissioners had asked all these questions to these past task force members about, all these all these policies that have been implemented in other jurisdictions. I wonder what would be a firsthand account from the folks that had to actually implement them. I don't want to prolong the reform timeline for the Elections Commission, but I also just think, given that, there were a lot of questions that were asked about how other jurisdictions have implemented something and whether San Francisco should implement it, maybe it might be an opportunity to actually reach out to those other jurisdictions, especially the ones that I think Common Cause California were in praise of, because I think in observing the San Francisco Redistricting Task Force, I had consulted with Common Cause California about what other jurisdictions to look into that, that maybe San Francisco should also adopt. And so when I observed the Redistricting Task Force, a lot of my comments were based off of like, oh, well, other jurisdictions are doing this. Maybe we should also do that too. So just an idea to throw out there. It's late, and thank you for everyone who took the time to to be at this meeting today. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else?
I don't see any other callers with their
Okay,
hands.
public comment is closed on that. Okay, so are there any other last comments before we move on?
I have noted the suggestion to possibly get representatives from other jurisdictions who've had a successful local redistricting cycle. As I mentioned earlier, we might actually have more time, depending on how the November election goes, to try to get it right here in San Francisco. And I also did want to acknowledge that our newest commissioner has agreed to step up and join me and be my partner in crime in kind of working out the educational schedule and relieving Vice President Stone to work on other aspects of the Election Commission.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Levolsi. Well, good. So then I want us to give us a chance to have a restroom break, stretch break, but we can do that maybe shortly into the next item because we're likely going to have to do a transition anyways. So if people can hold on just a little bit longer. I'm assuming people want to have a chance to.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's move on to, thank you again to all of the speakers. Really appreciate you being here. So switch back to agenda item number 11, public employee appointment / hiring director of elections. Discussion and possible action. The director of elections' current 5-year term expires at 12 a.m. on May 21st, 2023. The charter requires that the commission appoint a director for the next term at least 30 days before the expiration of the current term. At this meeting, the commission may decide either to appoint the incumbent director to an additional 5-year term or to engage in a competitive selection process in which the incumbent director may participate. Portions of the meeting may be held in closed session pursuant to California Government Code and San Francisco Administrative Code. Okay, so as the text reads, this is a process we have to do every 5 years because of the charter, and just follow along on the items here. Public comment on all matters pertaining to this agenda item, including any comment pertaining to the director of elections selection appointment and or whether to meet in closed session. So is there any public commenters on this item?
Yes, Mr. Turner? Oh, we have 2 commenters. Mr. Turner, you will be commenting, okay, I'm sorry. You will be commenting on the public employee appointment hiring director of elections. You are unmuted and you have 3 minutes to comment.
Thank you again, Martha, and thanks to everyone, Gwen, Craig, and the previous panelists, and for everybody for sticking around, and the public commenters who certainly don't need to apologize for making public comment. I think it's been a robust discussion throughout tonight's event. Regarding this particular agenda item, I think it is prudent and appropriate to open up the process. I know there's we've been having John Arnst is the person in charge for quite a large amount of years. We've been with the same salesperson who switched companies a couple times, but we've only had one salesperson in a decade. We've only had one head of elections. John has done a great job, but I think opening it up to the general field, there's a lot of technology forward people, a lot of women of color that have expressed interest in the position. I'm sure that people would like to apply, and John could apply as well. That seems to be a fair mode at this time. And I just appreciate everybody's input tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Turner.
Okay, we do have another caller, and I will unmute you, and you're commenting on public employee appointment, hiring, director of elections. You have 3 minutes to comment.
David Philpell, perhaps the last time tonight. Hard to know exactly what to say on this. I do think that Director Arntz has done a good job. I do not know if he is interested in renewing for another 5 years or up to 5 years. I don't know if you can ask that in open session or if you may discuss that in closed session. If he decides not to renew, or if you decide not to reappoint, then certainly May or prior to May would be a fine time to do that between elections. I'm not sure that there's anything driving the decision-making tonight. I certainly would not want to see any kind of transition prior to certification of the November election. So I'm a bit of a loss to figure out why this is before you right now. Maybe there's something going on that I don't know. That's entirely possible. So I guess I had kind of forgotten about the specific civil service rule, so it's good that that's before you. I had a chance to refresh on that. There certainly are some steps that the commission needs to take with regard to this appointment, and you'll take care to do that. But again, I think that Director Arntz has done a good job, and I'll leave it at that and wait for your announcement out of closed session as to which direction you're taking, if you're taking action on it at all tonight. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Philpott.
I don't see any other hands raised.
Okay, so is there any discussion before we take a vote to move into closed session?
Are we allowed to ask in public in the public setting if Director Arntz would like to be or reappointed, or would that happen in the closed or open?
Oh, well, we could ask. I did ask Director Arntz before the meeting, so but it's up to you.
Just giving him the opportunity. Just.
Okay. So do we have a motion?
I move that we go into closed session.
Okay.
I second.
Okay. So any commission discussion on the motion? Okay, seeing none. So Secretary Delgadillo?
Okay. President Giordano, how do you vote?
Yes.
Vice President Stone?
Yes.
Commissioner Dye?
Yes.
Commissioner Bernholz?
Yes.
And Commissioner Lee Volsi?
Yes.
Thank you. With 5 in the affirmative, it passes.
Okay, so we're going to go into closed session, and then everyone can take a little stretch break, restroom break. Yeah, and we will be clearing the room. So And we'll be setting up the microphone to make sure it's in closed session. So you can just come back here in 5 minutes.
Okay.
So we are back into open session. The time is now 10:26 p.m. And also for the record, we voted to go into closed session at 9:22 p.m., which I neglected to say earlier. Okay, so following along on the agenda, we're on subitem D, discussion and vote pursuant to the Sunshine Ordinance on whether to disclose any portion of the closed session discussion regarding the public employee performance evaluation. So do we have a motion not to disclose anything?
You report no action was taken during the closed session.
Okay, well, that says under E, it says to report the action taken.
Yes, D, and then E is to disclose. So you can just report no action was taken during closed session.
Yeah, I was going to do that under E. It says report action taken under E. But I mean, I can reverse the order if you want.
No, so D is you just report that no action was taken, and E is you make a vote on whether to disclose anything about the closed session.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm using the old agenda. Sorry about that. I'm using the old one. Which, that was actually one of the changes here. Okay, so we're on item D. So no action was taken during the closed session. Okay, and then let's move on to E. Discussion and vote pursuant to the Sunshine Ordinance on whether to disclose any portion of the closed session regarding the performance evaluation. Would anyone like to make a motion? So I can do it. I move that we disclose no portion of the closed session discussion.
Second.
Okay. Is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing none. Secretary Delgadillo?
Okay, President Bernald, I'm sorry, President Jordanic, how do you vote?
Yes.
Vice President Stone, how do you vote?
Yes.
Commissioner Bernald, how do you vote? And Commissioner Guy, how do you
Aye.
vote? And Commissioner Volsi, how do you vote?
Yes.
Thank you. With 5 in the affirmative, it passes.
Great. So the time is now 10:29 p.m. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful night.